There is a moment, if you have ever stood in a crowd somewhere on the European continent, maybe in a market square in Germany, or a train station in France, or a busy piazza in northern Italy, where something quietly unsettles you. You look around at the faces, the colouring, the height of people, the particular way light catches their features, and something registers in the back of your mind. These people look similar to you in many ways. The architecture of the face is broadly familiar. The range of hair colours, while varied, follows patterns you recognise. But then you remember something, or maybe you notice it for the first time, that when you step off a plane at Heathrow, when you walk through the streets of London or Manchester or York, the faces you pass carry something different, something that sits just below the level of easy description but above the threshold of coincidence. The English, as a population, look different from other Europeans. Not entirely different, not alien, not so distinct that the difference is obvious to every casual observer at every moment, but different enough that physical anthropologists have remarked on it for well over a century. Different enough that the genetic data, which has poured out of British universities and research hospitals over the last 15 years in volumes that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations of scientists, confirms something genuinely unusual happened on that island, and something that set the people living there on a biological trajectory distinct from their nearest continental neighbours. And the answer to why that happened is stranger and older and more layered than almost anyone has told you. It begins before Britain was even an island. It runs through a catastrophe so large that it buried an entire landmass beneath the North Sea. It involves a population replacement so thorough that modern geneticists, when they first looked at the data, struggled to believe what they were seeing. It weaves together ice ages, waves of migration from the Eurasian steppes, a lost Bronze Age people whose origin still generates fierce academic debate, the nearly total erasure of whoever came before, and then a second erasure, and then a third. Layer upon layer of genetic overwriting, each wave bringing something new, each wave leaving its mark in ways that accumulated over thousands of years into the specific physical profile that makes the English population, even today, a genuine outlier on the European genetic map. This is not a story about racial superiority or inferiority. That framing has been used to distort this history before, and we are going to set it aside completely, because the actual science tells a story far more interesting than anything nationalism ever invented. This is a story about geology and climate and sea level and the sheer accident of geography. It is a story about what happens when a piece of land breaks away from a continent and then gets inhabited and then gets replaced, and then replaced again and then partially replaced one more time. Each time by people coming from directions and distances that make the whole sequence feel almost implausible. And underneath all of it, still running like a very old river beneath newer sediment, there is something that the latest genetic studies are only beginning to find words for. A deep ancestral layer, a population that appears to have been here before almost anyone else, that left traces in the DNA of modern Welsh and Cornish and Scottish people that do not match anything we find in continental Europe, that points toward a chain of ancestry stretching back into a period so remote that the landscape of Britain itself would have been unrecognizable. There are people alive today in this country whose DNA carries echoes of populations that were here when mammoths still grazed on the plains of what would become the English Midlands. That is where this story starts, if you are watching this to fall asleep. That is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it is one of the things I genuinely love about making these. Seeing someone in Auckland just waking up, someone in Toronto settling in for the night, someone in Edinburgh with the rain against the window. We are all, in our own small way, doing what humans have always done, gathering in the dark to hear old stories about where we came from. The comment section becomes its own strange kind of community, and I am always glad you are here. Now, before there was an English Channel, before there was a North Sea in the form we recognize today, before the island of Britain was an island at all, there was a landscape, a vast, cold, relatively flat landscape that connected what we now call southeastern England to what we now call the Netherlands, Belgium, northern Germany, and Denmark. It was not ocean, it was land. Dry land, traversable land, land with rivers running through it, and animals grazing on it, and eventually, people moving across it. Geologists call this lost landmass Doggerland, named after the Dogger Bank, the shallow shelf of seafloor that represents its highest remaining remnant, a ridge of drowned hills poking up toward the surface of the North Sea. The name comes from the Dutch fishing term for a type of boat used to trawl those waters, and it has an accidental poetry to it, a name for something that was once above water, now applied to the water itself. Doggerland was not a small place. At its maximum extent, during the height of the last ice age and in the millennia immediately following, it covered an area comparable to modern France. It had its own rivers, some of them large, including a river system that drained what is now the British interior, and flowed eastward to meet the Rhine before continuing north into what would have been cold, shallow coastal waters. There were lakes, there were forests of pine and birch, and later, as the climate warmed, oak and elm and hazel. There were marshes and estuaries teeming with waterfowl. There were fish runs in the rivers and shellfish beds along the coasts, and herds of aurochs and deer moving through the woodland. It was, in short, a good place to live. And people did live there. We know this not from written records, because there were none, but from what trawlers and fishing boats have been pulling up from the seafloor for more than 100 years. Bones of animals, stone tools, harpoon points made from antler. A skull fragment, pieces of worked wood. Even on one extraordinary occasion, in 1931, a lump of peat containing what appeared to be an anchor stone, pulled up from about 50 meters of water in the middle of what is now the North Sea. The material keeps surfacing, keeps being dragged up in nets and dredges, keeps being recognized by eagle-eyed museum curators and archaeologists who know what to look for. And what it tells us is that Doggerland was inhabited. It was home to Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, people living roughly between 9,000 and 6,000 years ago in the period immediately following the end of the last ice age. People who were anatomically identical to modern humans, who used sophisticated composite tools made of flint, microliths set in wooden or antler handles, who tracked animal migrations and exploited seasonal plant resources, and caught fish with nets and harpoons, whose social lives we can only glimpse through the things they left behind, but who were, in every sense that matters, fully human. Some of the people who lived in Doggerland would have moved west, onto the higher ground that would eventually become Britain. Some would have moved east, onto the higher ground that would eventually become Northern Europe. The distinction between east and west, between what became British and what became continental, had not yet been made. They were the same people, moving freely across connected terrain, a single population shifting across a single landscape. And then the water came up. The process was not instantaneous. It happened over thousands of years, and its pace was not steady. There were periods when the sea rose faster, and periods when it slowed. There may have been episodes of flooding followed by temporary stabilization, times when a particular stretch of coast that had been inundated receded slightly before the general trend resumed. The people living through it would not have experienced it as a single catastrophe, but as a long, generational process of loss, a slow erasure of familiar landscape, the gradual disappearance of places that grandparents remembered, but that children would never see. But there was one event, or what appears to have been one event, that accelerated things dramatically. Around 8,000 years ago, a massive submarine landslide occurred off the coast of Norway. The Storegga slide, as geologists call it, involved a collapse of the seafloor so large that it generated a tsunami. A wave, or series of waves, that struck the coastlines of what were then the coastal regions of Doggerland with enormous force. The precise height of the wave when it reached the low-lying marshes and river valleys of Doggerland is still debated, but the sedimentary evidence is clear. A layer of tsunami deposit runs through coastal site after coastal site across what is now the Scottish and northeastern English coast, a thin but unmistakable stripe of marine sediment where there should be terrestrial deposit. The Storegga tsunami would not have destroyed Doggerland on its own. The land was already sinking and the sea was already rising. but it would have dramatically accelerated the loss of the lowest lying areas, perhaps converting habitable marsh and estuary into open water over the course of days rather than centuries. It would have driven people who lived near the coast inward. It would have cut off some lower-lying sections of land from higher ground, creating islands where there had been hills, turning river crossings into sea crossings. By approximately 6,500 years ago, the process was essentially complete. Britain was an island. The connection to continental Europe had been severed. The North Sea had formed. The English Channel had deepened and widened. Whatever people were living in, what would become England, Wales, and Scotland, were now separated from their continental counterparts by water, and the populations that had once been continuous began to diverge. That divergence is the first chapter of the story of why the English look the way they do, but it is only the first. The people who were living in Britain when it finally became an island, the inheritors of that Mesolithic tradition, the descendants of the Doggerland hunter-gatherers who had moved onto higher ground before the flood, were a remarkable population. We know this because of what has happened in British archaeology over the last decade, a revolution in ancient DNA analysis that has transformed our understanding of prehistoric Britain more thoroughly than a century of excavation alone. In 2018, a research team published analysis of the genome of a man whose remains had been found in Gough's Cave in Cheddar Gorge, Somerset. He had died approximately 9,100 years ago. The cave is one of the most important Paleolithic sites in Britain, a deep limestone cavern in the Mendip Hills that has been yielding human and animal remains for over a century. The man found there, given the name Cheddar Man by the researchers, had been buried in the cave at some point in the Mesolithic period, a few thousand years before the world he inhabited would be erased by the people who came after him. The analysis of his genome produced a result that generated headlines around the world, and not only because of what it revealed about his ancestry. Cheddar Man had dark skin, not the pale, easily sunburned skin that we now associate with the British population, not even the olive-toned skin of many southern Europeans. Dark skin in the range that modern population genetics associates with sub-Saharan or North African ancestry. And paired with that dark skin, the analysis suggested with high probability were blue eyes, the dark-skinned, blue-eyed Mesolithic British. This combination sounds paradoxical to modern sensibilities because we associate light eyes with light skin, and that association is in fact genetically grounded for later European populations. But Cheddar Man and his contemporaries represent a period before the genetic variant responsible for pale skin had become widespread in Northern Europe. The mutation that drives light skin in modern European populations appears to have spread relatively recently, within the last 10,000 years or so, driven by the same agricultural and dietary changes that reshaped European genetics broadly. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Britain, the people who lived here after the ice retreated and before the farmers arrived, were not pale. They were dark-skinned, sometimes blue-eyed, and they were deeply connected to a population that stretched across the Atlantic coast of Europe, from Britain down through Ireland and the Iberian Peninsula. Modern genetic analysis shows that the Western hunter-gatherers, as this population is called by researchers, were a distinct genetic lineage, separate from the hunter-gatherers who inhabited Central and Eastern Europe at the same time, and they left traces. In the modern genetic profiles of populations on the Atlantic fringe of Europe, in Wales and Cornwall and Scotland, in Ireland and the Basque Country and parts of Brittany, there are signals in the ancient DNA record that point back to this Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. These are populations that were, for various geographical and cultural reasons, partially protected from the waves of genetic replacement that washed over most of Europe in subsequent millennia. The Basque people of northern Spain, who have puzzled geneticists and linguists for generations with their seemingly anomalous genetic profile and their completely isolated language, carry high frequencies of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. The modern Welsh, whose language preserves sounds and grammatical structures that strike even other European language speakers as remarkably archaic, carry genetic signals that point back to the same deep Mesolithic substrate. This is not, let us be absolutely clear, evidence of racial superiority or of any mystical connection between these populations. It is simply evidence of geography. When the great waves of migration that transformed European genetics arrived from the east, they moved along the paths of least resistance. They followed river valleys and spread across plains. The mountainous coastal regions, the peninsulas and islands, the places that were harder to reach and less immediately attractive to agricultural settlers, tended to receive less of the new genetic material. The old populations persisted there more completely, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we can understand what those later migrations did to Britain, we need to understand what Britain looked like in the 4,000 years between the formation of the island and the arrival of the people who would almost completely transform it. Those 4,000 years belonged to the Western hunter-gatherers, and to an extent that we are only beginning to appreciate, they were not passive inhabitants of an empty landscape. They managed that landscape. They moved through it according to seasonal patterns that were calibrated to the movements of animals and the ripening of plant foods. They used controlled burning to maintain open grassland that attracted game. They had detailed knowledge of every river, every seasonal camp, every location where flint of the right quality for tool-making could be found. Their social networks stretched across the island and out across the sea to Ireland and possibly to the continent, because we find evidence of material exchange, of flint types moving long distances, of shell ornaments turning up far from any coast. They were not numerous by modern standards. The entire population of Mesolithic Britain may have been somewhere in the range of 5,000 to 10,000 people at any given time. That is fewer people than live in a small English market town today. But they had been here for a long time. They knew this place deeply, and they left traces in the landscape that we are still finding. Ancient camps along river margins, middens of shell and bone along the coast, the shadows of hearths in the soil of Somerset and the Pennines and the far north of Scotland. And then, around 6,000 years ago, something happened that would change Britain more profoundly than anything that had come before. The farmers arrived, not English farmers, not anything resembling what we would recognize as English or even European in the modern sense. The people who brought agriculture to Britain came originally from Anatolia, from the region we now call Turkey, the descendants of the populations that had first domesticated wheat and barley and cattle and sheep in the Fertile Crescent thousands of years earlier. They had already spread across Central Europe, moving generation by generation into new territories, carrying their package of domesticated animals and seed crops and pottery and, crucially, their genes. When they reached Britain, the island was not empty. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers were still here. They had been here for thousands of years. They had a language, though we have no idea what it sounded like. They had a cosmology, though we can only guess at its shape from the things they buried with their dead. They had knowledge of this landscape that the incoming farmers could not have matched. And yet, within a relatively short period, perhaps a few centuries, perhaps somewhat longer, the genetic signal of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in Britain collapses almost completely. The ancient DNA data from British Neolithic sites, from the long barrows and megalithic tombs that the incoming farmers built to house their dead, shows populations that are overwhelmingly of Anatolian Neolithic ancestry. The Western hunter-gatherer signal is not entirely gone, not in all sites, not in all individuals. There are Neolithic Britons who carry a few percent of hunter-gatherer ancestry, evidence of some interbreeding at the margins. But the dominant signature of Neolithic Britain, from roughly 4000 BCE onward, is the Anatolian farming population. What happened to the hunter-gatherers? We genuinely do not know. There is no evidence of a sudden massacre, no layer of burned sites, no dramatic violent end visible in the archaeological record. The transition seems to have happened relatively quickly by archaeological standards, but not overnight. It may have been a combination of factors. Incoming farmers, with higher population growth rates, simply outcompeting the hunter-gatherers for resources. A degree of assimilation at the edges, where some hunter-gatherers joined farming communities and had their descendants absorbed. And possibly the devastating effect of the new diseases that agricultural populations carried, diseases that spread through dense populations and that had not been part of the Mesolithic disease environment. Whatever the mechanism, by around 4,000 years ago, Britain had been transformed. The people living here were, predominantly, the descendants of Anatolian farmers. They had built an astonishing array of monuments, the long barrows that still dot the English countryside, great earthen mounds encasing stone chambers, filled with the bones of the community's dead, were their creation. Causewayed enclosures, strange circular earthworks that seemed to have served as gathering places for dispersed communities, were theirs. And most famously, the early phases of Stonehenge were theirs. The builders of the first Stonehenge were not the ancestors of the modern English. They were not even particularly closely related to the people who would eventually live on this island and speak English. They were Neolithic farmers of Anatolian descent, physically distinct from both their Mesolithic predecessors and from the population that would eventually replace them as well. Because another replacement was coming. Around 4,500 years ago, a new material culture began appearing across Europe. Archaeologists call it the bell beaker culture, named for the distinctive bell-shaped pottery vessels that accompany it in burial sites across a huge area stretching from Iberia to Central Europe to Britain and Ireland. The bell beaker phenomenon has been one of the great debates in European prehistory for generations. Was it a cultural package that spread through trade and imitation, with people adopting new styles of pottery and metalworking and burial practice without necessarily moving themselves? Or was it people, actual migration of actual bodies, carrying their genes and their pots and their cattle across the continent? The ancient DNA has answered this question, and the answer has shaken the field. It was people. Overwhelmingly, unambiguously, people. The bell beaker migration into Britain, which appears to have accelerated around 2400 BCE, represents one of the most dramatic population replacements in European prehistory. The ancient DNA evidence from British sites spanning the period before and after the bell beaker arrival shows a genetic turnover of extraordinary magnitude. Studies published in the last decade suggest that within a few centuries of the bell beaker, people arriving in Britain, somewhere between 80 and 90% of the existing Neolithic British genome had been replaced. 80 to 90%. The Neolithic farmers who had built Stonehenge, who had constructed the long barrows, who had transformed the British landscape with their fields and their flocks, were almost entirely erased, genetically speaking. The people who came after them, the bell beaker people, and their descendants, were not their children. They were newcomers from a different ancestral tradition entirely. Where did the bell beaker people come from? The genetic evidence traces their origins, ultimately, to the Yamnaya culture of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea in what is now Ukraine and Russia. The Yamnaya were a pastoralist people, herders of cattle and sheep, mobile in a way that agricultural populations were not, riding horses and driving ox-drawn wagons across the open steppe. They had a genetic profile quite different from both the Western hunter-gatherers and the Anatolian farmers who had spread into Europe from the southeast. The Yamnaya, or their descendants in the corded ware culture that preceded bell beaker in Central Europe, carried a set of genetic traits that modern population geneticists have been able to trace with remarkable precision. They had high frequencies of certain variants associated with lighter skin, lighter eyes, and lighter hair, traits that had been present at lower frequencies in earlier European populations, but that the steppe ancestry brought in at much higher levels. They also carried lactase persistence, the genetic variant that allows adults to digest milk, which gave them an extraordinary subsistence advantage in a landscape where they were keeping large herds of cattle. When the bell beaker people arrived in Britain, they brought this steppe genetic legacy with them, and as they replaced the Neolithic population over the course of a few centuries, the physical profile of Britain shifted. The people who emerged from the other side of this replacement, the early Bronze Age British, were different from their predecessors, different in their genetics, different in their physical traits, different in their culture. And here is something worth sitting with for a moment, because it matters for understanding everything that came after. The early Bronze Age British, these Bell Beaker descendants with their high-step ancestry, were the genetic foundation upon which the subsequent history of the English would be built. The people who lived in Britain during the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, who raised the stone circles that still dot the landscape, who mined the copper and tin that gave the period its name, who buried their dead in round barrows on hilltops across southern England, were predominantly descendants of this Bell Beaker population. And that population was already, by European standards, distinctive. The particular combination of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry and Anatolian Neolithic ancestry and Steppe-Yamnaya ancestry that characterized Bronze Age Britain was not identical to the combinations forming in other parts of Europe at the same time. Each region received these waves of migration at different times and in different proportions. The mixing happened differently in different places. And Britain, as an island, had a specific dynamic that continental populations did not share. Once the Bell Beaker replacement was essentially complete, the island's geography slowed subsequent gene flow from the continent. New populations coming in had to cross water to get here. That barrier was not absolute, but it was real, and it meant that Britain's genetic evolution after the Bronze Age was partly insulated from continental trends. The Bronze Age British, therefore, began to accumulate their own specific genetic profile, shaped by the island's geography and climate and the particular pressures of island life. Genetic drift, the random fluctuation of gene frequencies in populations that are partially isolated, began to play a role. Traits that were present at relatively low frequencies in the founding population could drift up to higher frequencies over generations simply by chance. Traits present at higher frequencies could drift higher still. This is one part of the answer to the original question. The English, and more broadly the British, began to diverge from continental Europeans, not only because of what arrived here, but because of what happened after arrival, on an island that slowed the mixing, that would have kept them aligned with continental trends. But the story does not stop there, because the Bronze Age was followed by the Iron Age, which was followed by the Roman period, which was followed by the centuries of migration and conquest that transformed Britain from a late Roman province into something recognizable as the ancestor of modern England. And each of those transitions left its genetic mark, in ways that were sometimes larger and sometimes smaller than the historical record suggests. The Iron Age in Britain, the period from roughly 700 BCE to the Roman invasion in 43 CE, is often associated in popular imagination with the Celts. Celtic warriors with their chariots and their torques and their complex artistic tradition. Celtic priests, the Druids, with their oak groves and their human sacrifices. Celtic tribes with names like the Iceni and the Brigantes and the Trainovantes, whose descendants, or at least linguistic descendants, would maintain a distinctly British identity even after centuries of Roman rule. The question of where the Celts came from is itself a matter of significant academic debate. The traditional view held that Celtic languages and cultures spread into Britain from continental Europe, probably from the Hallstatt and Latene, cultural zones of Central Europe during the Iron Age. A more recent view, with growing genetic support, suggests that the Celtic languages of Britain and Ireland may be much older on this island, associated with the Bell Beaker migration itself or with the Atlantic Bronze Age trading networks that preceded the Iron Age. What the ancient DNA evidence does show is that there was no dramatic genetic disruption at the Bronze Age to Iron Age transition in Britain. The people living in Britain during the Iron Age are largely genetically continuous with the people living there during the Bronze Age. There may have been some gene flow from the continent during the Iron Age, and the genetics of Iron Age Britain are not homogeneous across the island. But there is nothing like the dramatic replacement event of the Bell Beaker period. The Iron Age British, whatever language or languages they were speaking, whatever cultural identity they held, were predominantly the descendants of the Bell Beaker immigrants and the small residual population that had survived the Bronze Age transition. They were the people who resisted Rome, some of them, and who accommodated Rome, others of them, and who, over the 4 centuries of Roman occupation, became something complicated and difficult to classify. Roman Britain is one of the most frequently misunderstood periods in English history, particularly when it comes to genetics. The Roman occupation of Britain lasted from 43 CE to the early 5th century, approximately 370 years. During that time, Rome stationed legions and auxiliary units in Britain, drawn from every corner of the empire. There were soldiers from North Africa, from Syria, from the Rhineland, from Thrace, from Spain, from the Danube frontier. There are inscriptions from the northern wall that record men born in places as distant as Palmyra. There are archaeological traces of African communities in York. The Roman Empire was genuinely multi-ethnic in ways that sometimes surprise people who have internalized later European constructions of race. And yet, the genetic impact of the Roman period on the British population appears to have been surprisingly limited. The ancient DNA evidence from Roman period British sites shows a population that is still predominantly descended from Iron Age British ancestry. There are individuals with continental European or Mediterranean ancestry, as you would expect from a garrison population drawing from across the empire, but they do not appear to have transformed the genetic profile of the broader population in any dramatic way. Why? Probably because the Roman presence in Britain was concentrated in specific contexts: military garrisons, urban centres, elite administrative contexts. The rural population, which was the majority of the population, continued largely as before, farming the same landscapes under Roman taxation and Roman law, but not marrying large numbers of Roman incomers. The incomers were mostly men, soldiers, and administrators, and while some certainly settled and had children, their overall genetic contribution to the British population was diluted by the enormous rural majority who remained genetically continuous with their Iron Age ancestors. 370 years of Roman occupation, and the genetic signal is modest. That is worth thinking about carefully, because it suggests something important about how these large-scale genetic replacements work. Military and administrative elite presence alone is not sufficient to produce dramatic genetic change. You need mass movement of civilian population, or you need the elimination and replacement of the existing population for the genetic signal to be dramatic. Which brings us to what happened next. In the early 5th century, Roman administrative and military presence in Britain collapsed. The exact sequence of events is disputed, and the sources are sparse and tendentious. But the outline is clear. Roman troops were withdrawn, or simply ceased to be paid and supplied. The administrative infrastructure broke down, and Britain was left to manage itself in a context of economic collapse, political fragmentation, and external raiding from multiple directions. Into this vacuum came the Anglo-Saxons. The name Anglo-Saxon is itself a simplification, a term applied by later writers to the Germanic-speaking peoples who came from the coastal areas of what is now Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, and settled in eastern and southern Britain from the 5th century onward. They were not a single unified group. They were Angles and Saxons and Jutes and Frisians and probably others, speaking related but distinct dialects, organized into separate chieftains and kingdoms, settling in different regions and founding different political entities. What they replaced, or transformed, or absorbed was the late Roman British population. The people living in eastern and southern Britain when the Anglo-Saxons began to arrive were the descendants of Iron Age Britons, with modest Roman period additions. They were speaking, in all probability, a Brittonic Celtic language closely related to what would become Welsh. They were Christian, many of them, having absorbed Christianity during the Roman period. They were living in the ruins of a Roman provincial economy, in communities that had collapsed from the complexity of Roman urban life, back towards something more like late Iron Age village agriculture. The question of what the Anglo-Saxons did to this population is one that has exercised historians and archaeologists for generations. And the answers that ancient DNA have provided are some of the most startling in the entire history of British genetics. The ancient DNA evidence from sites across eastern England, spanning the transition from Roman to early medieval, shows a dramatic genetic discontinuity. In some regions, particularly in areas of early and dense Anglo-Saxon settlement, The proportion of continental Germanic ancestry in the post-Roman population reaches 50, 60, even 70%. The Brittonic British, the people who had been living there during the Roman period, do not disappear from the genetic record, but they become a minority in their own homeland, genetically speaking. This is not the same as saying that they were massacred. The academic debate on the mechanisms of the Anglo-Saxon genetic replacement is still active. The possibilities range from large-scale migration, in which incoming Anglo-Saxons simply outnumbered the existing population, to an elite dominance model in which Anglo-Saxon culture and language spread among the existing population, while a smaller number of actual incomers married preferentially within their own community and reproduced at higher rates than the Britons, gradually shifting the genetic balance over generations. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and it probably varied significantly from region to region. The eastern coastal regions, the areas closest to the continental origin of the migrants, and the areas where settlement appears to have been earliest and densest, show the highest proportions of continental Germanic ancestry in ancient and modern DNA. The western regions, Wales and Cornwall, and the far north and west of England, show much lower proportions, consistent with Anglo-Saxon cultural and linguistic influence arriving later and less completely. But in the core of what would become England, in the Midlands and the East and the South, the genetic composition of the population had been substantially transformed by the early medieval period. The people who would eventually become the English were already, genetically, a distinct population from both the people who had preceded them on this land and the people who were living across the Channel in what would become France. And then the Vikings arrived. The Viking period in England runs roughly from the late 8th century, the first raids on Lindisfarne and other coastal monasteries, to the early 11th century. During that time, Scandinavian raiders became Scandinavian settlers, establishing the Danelaw across a large swathe of northern and eastern England, and eventually a Scandinavian king sat on the English throne. The genetic signal of the Viking period in England is visible, but not overwhelming in most regions. Modern genetic studies of English populations find Scandinavian ancestry that varies significantly by region. Highest in the north and east, where Danish and Norwegian settlers were most numerous. Lower in the south and west. The overall Scandinavian contribution to the modern English genetic profile is estimated at somewhere between 5 and 10%, varying regionally. That is meaningful but not transformative. But here is something interesting about the Viking contribution specifically. The Scandinavians who came to England were genetically somewhat different from the Anglo-Saxons who had preceded them, even though both groups were ultimately of continental Germanic origin. The Scandinavian populations of the Viking Age had their own specific genetic profile, their own particular combination of Iron Age European, steppe, and hunter-gatherer ancestry in proportions that differed from the Anglo-Saxon profile. And they were, on average, physically distinctive, taller, with higher frequencies of certain pigmentation variants. The addition of Scandinavian ancestry to the English gene pool did not reverse the Anglo-Saxon transformation, but it added another layer of genetic distinctiveness, another note in the particular chord that would eventually become the genetic profile of the English. And then, in 1066, the Normans arrived. The Norman conquest is perhaps the most famous event in English history. It is the moment when one English schoolchild in 10 can place a specific date, and it transformed the culture and language and political structures of England in ways that are still visible 1,000 years later. French became the language of the English court and the English law and the English church. Norman French vocabulary flooded into Old English and became part of what would eventually be modern English. The entire landholding structure of England was reorganized. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was largely dispossessed, and a Norman elite took control. But, genetically, the Norman conquest left a surprisingly faint trace. The Normans were themselves the descendants of Viking settlers in northern France, people who had intermarried with the Frankish population over several generations and adopted French language and culture while retaining elements of their Scandinavian identity. When they came to England, they were therefore already a mixed population, carrying Scandinavian and Frankish ancestry in roughly equal measure. The Norman elite replaced the Anglo-Saxon elite. They built their castles and their cathedrals. They reorganized the landscape with their deer parks and their rabbit warrens and their feudal manorial system. They changed the language of the ruling class. But they were a small minority, even in their own time. The vast majority of the English population in 1066 and in the decades following continued to be the descendants of Anglo-Saxon settlers and indigenous Britons and a sprinkling of earlier Viking settlers. The Norman lords married into English families over the generations, and their descendants became English, absorbed into the larger population, contributing their Norman genetics, but not dominating it. Genetic estimates of the Norman contribution to modern English ancestry are modest, somewhere in the range of 3 to 5%, depending on the region and the study. That is not nothing, but it is a very small return for an event that so completely transformed English culture and political life. The genetic lesson of the Norman conquest is the same as the lesson of Roman Britain. Elite conquest and political transformation do not, by themselves, produce dramatic genetic change. Mass migration of civilian populations does. So by the high medieval period, the genetic composition of the English population had taken something close to its modern shape, a foundation of Mesolithic Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, present at low levels, a layer of Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry, a dominant contribution from the Bell Beaker steppe migrants and their descendants, which had itself been partially derived from an Atlantic Bronze Age population, a substantial Anglo-Saxon contribution, which was the single largest component in eastern England, a modest but meaningful Scandinavian contribution, heavier in the north and east, a thin layer of Norman ancestry, distributed among those families that had descended from the post-conquest elite. That mixture, combined over 1,500 years of island life, was the English. But why does this mixture look different from other Europeans? After all, the ingredients are all European. The steppe ancestry, the Neolithic farmer ancestry, the various medieval Germanic contributions. The same ingredients are present in German and Dutch and Danish populations. Why should the English look different? Several answers run together here, and they are worth examining one by one. The first is the specific proportions. The English genome does not contain the same proportions of these ancestral components as German or Dutch or Danish genomes. The steppe ancestry is there, but in a specific mix with the Neolithic farmer ancestry that differs from the mix found further east. The Anglo-Saxon contribution is significant, but was overlaid on an existing Iron Age British population that had itself been shaped by thousands of years of island isolation. The result is a combination that has its own specific character. The second is the persistence of the Atlantic fringe ancestry. The British, including the English, carry more Western hunter-gatherer ancestry than most continental European populations. This is partly because of the Bell Beaker population that replaced the Neolithic British, which itself carried a distinctive Western Atlantic genetic profile, and it is partly because of the specific history of the British Isles, where certain regions maintained older genetic profiles longer than their continental counterparts. The third is the island effect. An island population accumulates genetic drift in ways that a continental population does not. Certain gene variants that were present at particular frequencies in the founding populations of Anglo-Saxon England drifted over the centuries, some going up in frequency, some going down. The population was not entirely closed. The seas were crossed by traders and migrants throughout the medieval period and into the modern era. But it was more closed than comparable continental populations, and that insularity left a mark. The fourth is pigmentation genetics, and this is the part that is most directly visible to casual observation. The English, as a population, show particularly high frequencies of several pigmentation variants that together produce the characteristic English complexion. Very pale skin, blue or green eyes, fair or reddish hair. These traits are present in other European populations, but their frequency in the English population is notably high, higher than in most of continental Europe, comparable in some respects to the Irish and Scottish, but with its own specific profile. Why? The answer involves several factors working together. The steppe Yamnaya ancestry that came into Britain via the Belgica migration carried high frequencies of the SLC 24A5 and SLC 45A2 variants that drive lighter skin pigmentation. These variants had already spread into European populations from their likely origin in the population expansions that followed the last ice age, but they were at particularly high frequencies in steppe-derived populations and therefore in the Belgica immigrants. The Anglo-Saxon migrants who came from coastal Germany and Denmark in the 5th and 6th centuries, CE, also carried high frequencies of light pigmentation variants. The ancient DNA from Anglo-Saxon burial sites in Britain shows populations with very high frequencies of blue eye variants and light hair variants. They reinforced, in the English gene pool, a tendency toward light colouring that had already been established by the Belgica ancestry. The Scandinavian Viking settlers added another dose of the same tendency. Scandinavian populations are among the lightest pigmented in the world, carrying very high frequencies of the variants that produce blue eyes and fair hair. The Norman contribution, though modest, came from a population that was itself partly Scandinavian in ancestry. Layer upon layer of light pigmentation genetics, accumulating through each successive wave of migration from northern continental Europe, compounding over the centuries in a population that was partly isolated by its island geography. The result was a population that, by the high medieval period, was pushing toward the extreme end of the European pigmentation spectrum. And there is one more factor: vitamin D. Britain is not a sunny place. The latitude means that for much of the year, the sun is too low in the sky for human skin to synthesize adequate vitamin D from sunlight exposure, even in summer. In winter, vitamin D synthesis from sunlight is essentially impossible for most of the country. This creates a strong selective pressure for light skin, because pale skin synthesizes vitamin D more efficiently at low light levels than dark skin does. The selective pressure for light skin in Northern Europe has been recognized for some time, and Britain's position near the northwestern extreme of Europe means that this pressure is particularly strong here. Populations living in Britain for generation after generation, subject to this selective pressure, would have seen light skin variants favored by natural selection. Combined with the founding population effect from the Belgica and Anglo-Saxon migrations, which had already skewed the gene pool heavily toward light pigmentation, this selective pressure produced a population that is among the palest in the world. This is the short answer to the question the title poses. The English look different from most other Europeans, specifically in their very high frequencies of pale skin and blue or green eyes and fair or reddish hair, because of a specific combination of founding population genetics, sequential reinforcement from multiple waves of migration that all happened to come from northern populations with light pigmentation preferences, island genetic drift that amplified existing traits, and strong natural selection for light skin in a low sunlight environment. But that short answer strips out most of what makes the story interesting, because the story is not really about pigmentation. It is about the extraordinary geological and demographic accident that produced a population with this specific genetic history. Britain's island status, which created the conditions for that history, was itself an accident of geology and sea level change. The Doggerland submergence was the result of post-glacial sea level rise and the Storegga tsunami, events that no one planned and no population could have predicted or prevented. The Belgica replacement was a consequence of the expansion of steppe-derived populations across Europe, itself driven by factors including the collapse of the Neolithic European farming communities around 3000 BCE, possibly due to plague, possibly due to climate, possibly due to the military advantage of horseback riding. The Anglo-Saxon migration was a consequence of the collapse of Roman imperial power, itself driven by pressures too complex to summarize here. Each of the events that shaped the English genetic profile was contingent. It could have happened differently. It did happen differently in other parts of Europe. And the accumulation of contingencies, the specific sequence of replacements and reinforcements that happened in this particular island in this particular corner of the North Atlantic, produce something genuinely distinctive, something that you can see in the faces of people walking down a high street in Birmingham or Bristol or Norwich on a grey February afternoon, something that has been here in one form or another through 9,000 years of continuous human habitation of this island, something that carries within it, if you know how to read the genetic record, the whisper of a dark-skinned, blue-eyed Mesolithic hunter adjusting a harpoon point on the banks of a river that no longer exists, in a landscape that is now under 50 meters of North Sea. The story of why the English look the way they do is not a story about England at all. Not really. It is a story about time and about contingency and about the strange way that the deep past continues to flow through the present, visible in our faces if we know what we are looking at. Let us go further back and go deeper into some of those layers, because each one has its own texture, its own complexity, its own set of puzzles that the geneticists and archaeologists are still working through. The Amesbury Archer is one of the most remarkable individuals in British prehistoric archaeology. Found during construction work near Stonehenge in 2002, he was buried around 2300 BCE with the richest assemblage of grave goods of any burial found in Britain from that period. Gold ornaments, the earliest gold objects found in Britain to that point. Copper knives, flint arrowheads, boar's tusks, beaker pottery of the specific bell-shaped form that gives the bell beaker culture its name. He was, in other words, a high-status individual buried according to the bell beaker rite. He appears to have been a craftsman of some kind, possibly a metalworker, at a time when metalworking was new to Britain and likely associated with considerable prestige. And he was not British. Strontium isotope analysis of his tooth enamel, which records the chemistry of the water and food consumed in childhood, showed that he had grown up in the Alpine region of Europe, probably in what is now Switzerland or Austria or southern Germany. He had travelled to Britain from Central Europe and been buried with enormous ceremony near the monument that his contemporaries or immediate predecessors had built and were still using. He is a window into what the bell beaker phenomenon actually looked like on the ground. Not an abstract genetic replacement, not a demographic statistic, but a specific individual who had travelled enormous distances, who had skills that people valued enough to honour him with extraordinary burial goods, who died far from his homeland and was laid to rest near the most famous monument in Britain. And he was, based on all the evidence we have, carrying exactly the genetic profile you would expect from a bell beaker individual of alpine origin. High step ancestry, light pigmentation variants, the genetic signature of the population that would, over the following centuries, replace most of the Neolithic British population. The Amesbury Archer was, in a sense, one of the people who made the English possible. Not by any individual act, but by being part of a migration wave that transformed Britain's genetic makeup more thoroughly than any subsequent event. There is something vertiginous about holding that thought. Standing near Stonehenge, which is possible on ordinary days from a distance, looking at those stones that were placed there by the Neolithic people before the bell beaker arrival, and knowing that the Amesbury Archer was buried nearby not long after, that he came from the Alps and travelled to Britain and died here, that his people would largely replace the people who built those stones, and that somewhere in that sequence of events, across the following 4,000 years, the English emerged. But the story does not settle down after the bell beaker period. The Bronze Age itself, which lasted in Britain from roughly 2200 BCE to roughly 750 BCE, was not a static period. The genetic studies of Bronze Age British populations show that gene flow from continental Europe did not stop entirely after the initial bell beaker wave. There are individuals from Bronze Age British sites who show ancestry that points toward various continental sources, evidence that people continued to move between Britain and the continent throughout the period. The most striking of these Bronze Age movements involves what some researchers have called the steppe-related ancestry second wave, an increase in steppe-derived genetics in British Bronze Age populations compared to what you would expect from the bell beaker founding population alone. This suggests additional migration from continental Europe during the Middle and Late Bronze Age, possibly associated with the movements of peoples that were reshaping European genetics more broadly during this period. The Bronze Age in Europe was a period of intense connectivity. Metals were traded over vast distances. Amber moved from the Baltic coast to the Mediterranean. Tin moved from Cornwall and possibly from Brittany to supply the bronze smiths of Central Europe. People moved along these trade routes. Knowledge moved, and genes moved. Cliff's End Farm, a site in Kent, excavated in the 2000s and 2010s, produced some of the most remarkable evidence of Bronze Age mobility in Britain. Analysis of the human remains found there, spanning a period from the late Neolithic through the Bronze Age, showed that a significant proportion of the individuals had non-local origins, as indicated by their strontium isotope signatures. People had travelled to this site from as far away as the Mediterranean. Some of the individuals show ancestry pointing toward the Iberian Peninsula or North Africa. This is not evidence of a new population replacement. It is evidence of a connected world in which people moved, in which Britain was not isolated even in its island status, in which the traffic across the Channel and the North Sea and the Atlantic coast was continuous and multidirectional. The genetic distinctiveness of the English, therefore, did not arise from isolation in the sense of complete separation from continental Europe. It arose from the specific pattern of who was doing the connecting and in what direction and in what numbers. During the Bronze Age and Iron Age, the primary gene flow between Britain and the continent was broadly in both directions, but seems to have been weighted in ways that reinforced the existing British genetic profile rather than dramatically altering it. The dramatic alterations, the true replacements, were fewer in number. The Neolithic farmer arrival, the Bell Beaker arrival, and then, after a long interval, the Anglo-Saxon settlement. Each of these events produced the kind of genetic change that shows up unmistakably in the ancient DNA record. The periods between them show connectivity and exchange, but not replacement. This episodic pattern of stability punctuated by dramatic change is itself something that the genetics of the English population reflect. Modern English people carry within them traces of all these waves, but the traces are unequally weighted. The Bell Beaker steppe ancestry and the Anglo-Saxon continental Germanic ancestry are the dominant signals in most English populations today. The Neolithic Anatolian farmer ancestry is present but less prominent. The Western hunter-gatherer signal from the Mesolithic period is faint, mostly traceable through the Bell Beaker population's own partial descent from an Atlantic population that had more of it. Each layer is compressed by time, thinned out by the subsequent replacement, but not entirely erased. The complete history of the island is there in the genetics if you know how to look. Let us consider what this means for the specific physical traits that make the English, as a population, distinctive from their nearest continental neighbours. The French, to take the most obvious comparison, share many ancestral components with the English. They have Mesolithic Western hunter-gatherer ancestry from the Atlantic French and Breton populations. They have Neolithic Anatolian farmer ancestry from the farming revolution that spread through France before Britain. They have some steppe ancestry from the Bell Beaker and corded ware movements. They have contributions from various medieval Germanic groups, the Franks and the Burgundians and others who settled in Roman Gaul. But the proportions are different. France received more substantial gene flow from Mediterranean and Central European populations throughout the Bronze Age and Iron Age and Roman period. The Roman period left a more visible genetic trace in France than in Britain, partly because France was more thoroughly integrated into the Mediterranean economic and demographic network. The Frankish settlement of northern France in the early medieval period introduced Germanic ancestry, but from a Frankish population that was itself somewhat different from the Anglo-Saxon populations that were simultaneously settling Britain. The result is a French population that is, broadly speaking, intermediate between the more Mediterranean-influenced genetics of southern Europe and the more northern-influenced genetics of Britain. French pigmentation statistics differ from English ones. Lower frequencies of blue eyes, lower frequencies of the very pale skin that is common in England, higher frequencies of darker hair and olive skin, particularly in southern France, but even in the north to a degree. The Germans are closer to the English in some respects, given the Anglo-Saxon connection, but they too differ in ways that reflect their specific history. The German-speaking populations of Central Europe have higher steppe ancestry than the English in some regions, different Neolithic farmer ancestry profiles depending on the specific area, and contributions from multiple medieval period populations that differ from the Anglo-Saxon, English-founding populations. The Dutch are perhaps the most genetically similar modern population to the English, as you might expect given the Anglo-Saxon origin point in coastal Germany and the Netherlands, but even they differ in ways that reflect the different subsequent history of the two populations. The Dutch having been exposed to different gene flows through the medieval and early modern period. The Danes and other Scandinavians share more with the English than most continental Europeans, which again makes sense given the Viking period contribution and the common North Germanic heritage of both Anglo-Saxon and Viking ancestry. But Scandinavian populations have their own distinctive genetic profile, with very high frequencies of certain Northern European traits and a specific ancestry profile that reflects their own Mesolithic, Neolithic, and steppe ancestry in proportions that differ from the English. In each comparison, the English emerge as distinctive, not because they are entirely different from any of these populations, but because they sit at a specific point in the multidimensional genetic space of Europe, a point defined by their unique history of multiple replacements and island evolution, and the specific directional biases of the migration waves that shaped them. And there is one more layer to this story that we have not yet fully examined. The layer that involves what happened not to England specifically, but to Wales and Scotland and Cornwall, the regions where the older genetic signals persist most strongly. The Welsh are the most direct genetic descendants of the ancient British, the Iron Age and earlier populations of the island, because Wales was the region least thoroughly transformed by the Anglo-Saxon settlement. The ancient DNA evidence and the modern population genetics both show that Wales retains significantly higher proportions of pre-Anglo-Saxon British ancestry than England does, and that the Welsh therefore also retain higher proportions of the Belgica steppe ancestry, the Neolithic Anatolian ancestry, and even traces of the Western hunter-gatherer. Mesolithic ancestry informs that the English gene pool has diluted. This has a visible consequence in the Welsh population, one that is often commented on. The Welsh show higher frequencies of darker hair and different eye color distributions compared to the English, along with their own specific range of physical traits. They are not dramatically different, and both populations share deep ancestry, but the Welsh genetic profile is shifted in ways consistent with their greater preservation of the older British genetic background. Cornwall shows a similar pattern, though with its own specific history, a population that maintained Brittonic Celtic culture and genetics longer than much of England, absorbing Anglo-Saxon influence later and more incompletely, and therefore preserving older genetic signals at higher frequencies. Scotland is more complex because the Scottish Highlands and Islands show extremely strong retention of ancient British genetics, while the Scottish Lowlands show more similarity to Northern English populations, given the extent of Anglo-Saxon influence on the eastern Scottish lowland zone. The Orcadians, the people of Orkney, show yet another specific profile, reflecting their own history of Viking settlement and the particular genetics of the Norse settlers who came to dominate those islands. This variation within the British Isles is itself a kind of archive of the different histories of different parts of the archipelago, each region preserving or replacing the older genetic layer to different degrees depending on the timing and intensity of the various migration waves. And then there is the deepest layer of all, the thing that the most recent studies of ancient and modern British DNA are finding, the signal that does not fit neatly into any of the known migration waves. Researchers studying the genetic profile of populations on the Atlantic fringe of Britain, particularly in the far west of Wales, in Cornwall, in parts of western Scotland and Ireland, have found signals in the ancient DNA that point toward an ancestral population that predates even the Belgica migration, a population that seems to trace its origins not to the Yamnaya steppe or to Anatolian Neolithic farmers, but to an ancestral lineage associated with the Atlantic coast of Europe, in a period before the great Neolithic farmer migration reached Britain. This is sometimes called the Atlantic megalithic ancestry, and it is associated with the people who built the megalithic monuments of Western Europe in the period from roughly 4,500 to 2,500 BCE, the passage tombs of Ireland and Wales, the megalithic chambers of Brittany, the stone circles of Atlantic Europe, the cairns and cromlechs and dolmens that dot the western coast from Portugal to Scotland. The people who built these monuments were, in part, Neolithic farmers of Anatolian descent. But they were also something else, a population that had accumulated its own specific genetic character through long habitation of the Atlantic coast, mixing Mesolithic Western hunter-gatherer ancestry with early Neolithic farmer ancestry in ways that produced a distinctive profile. This Atlantic megalithic population is not well documented in the ancient DNA record yet, partly because the western coastal sites where it would most likely be preserved are difficult to excavate, and the DNA in coastal environments is often poorly preserved. But the signals that appear in the western fringe of the British Isles today, the genetic components that do not match any of the known later migrations, point toward it. There are people in Wales and Cornwall and Western Scotland today whose DNA carries traces of this population, which means there are people whose ancestry includes individuals who were building stone chambers on Atlantic hilltops 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, before the Bell Beaker people arrived, before the Anglo-Saxons, before the Vikings and the Normans, before almost anyone else we have named in this story. The oldest layer, the most deeply buried, the one that science is only now beginning to lift. Britain has been inhabited by recognizably modern humans for at least 15,000 years, since the retreat of the last ice sheets opened the land for recolonization. In those 15,000 years, it has been transformed so thoroughly, so repeatedly, that the people living here today carry within them the genetic memory of multiple near extinctions and multiple reinventions, of lost landscapes and drowned countries and civilizations that have left no written record, but whose presence persists in the quiet signals of ancient DNA. The English are the product of all of this, not of any single moment or any single migration, not of any particular chosen origin story, the product of 9,000 years of geological accident and demographic contingency, of ice and sea and steppe and forest and bronze and iron, of farmers crossing the channel in dugout canoes and warriors riding horses from the grasslands east of the Caspian Sea, and fishermen from the Danish coast beaching their boats on the Suffolk shore. And the face you see in the mirror, if you are English, is the face of all of them, compressed and accumulated and expressed in the particular combination of pigmentation and bone structure and height and build that emerged from that extraordinary sequence of events. That face is unique in Europe, because that sequence was unique in Europe. That is the answer to the question the title poses. But there are depths in this answer that we have not yet fully sounded, angles on the story that open into further mysteries and further puzzles, and it would be a shame to stop here when there is more to explore. The genetic distinctiveness of the English is visible at the level of pigmentation, as we have discussed, but it is also visible in other ways that are less immediately obvious to casual observation. One of the most striking is height distribution. The English and the British more broadly are, on average, taller than populations in southern Europe and somewhat taller than many Central European populations, though not quite as tall as the Dutch or some Scandinavian populations. This height distribution tracks to a considerable extent with the distribution of steppe ancestry in European populations. The Yamnaya and their descendants were unusually tall by the standards of Neolithic European populations, and the regions of Europe that received the highest doses of steppe ancestry through the Bell, Beaker, and Corded Ware migrations tend to be the taller regions today. Britain, with its high Bell Beaker steppe ancestry, would be expected on this basis to be on the tall end of the European distribution. And it is. Height genetics in the English population reflects, among other things, the founding event of the Bell Beaker migration 4,500 years ago. Another distinctive feature of the English genetic profile is the distribution of specific immune-related gene variants. The human leukocyte antigen system, the HLA system, which governs immune response and is one of the most genetically variable regions of the human genome, shows specific patterns in the English population that reflect its particular history of disease exposure and founder effects. The English HLA profile differs in measurable ways from those of French or German or Dutch populations, reflecting both the specific pathogens that have circulated in Britain over millennia and the founder effects introduced by the various migration waves. This is relevant not just as a genetic curiosity, but as a practical matter. The English population shows somewhat different disease susceptibility patterns for certain autoimmune conditions and infectious diseases compared to continental European populations. The specific combination of ancestral HLA variants in the English gene pool is another form of the distinctiveness that we are tracking. There is also the matter of blood type distributions. The ABO blood group system, one of the oldest classification systems in human genetics, shows different frequencies across European populations. The English population shows a specific distribution of A, B, O, and AB blood types that reflects its particular genetic history, different in detail from French or German or Scandinavian distributions, though all of them overlap significantly. None of these things, taken individually, are dramatic enough to be visible to the naked eye or to explain the intuitive sense that the English look different from other Europeans. But they are all expressions of the same underlying reality, a genetic history that diverged from continental European norms at multiple points and in consistent directions, producing a coherent package of physical and biological traits that is measurably distinct. The question that lingers, and that the geneticists themselves debate, is whether the English continue to diverge from continental norms or whether modern mobility and migration are beginning to close the gap. Britain in the 21st century is far more connected to the rest of the world and far more genetically diverse in its urban centres than at any previous point in its history. The genetic profile of London is dramatically different from the genetic profile of rural England and from the genetic profile of any English city 300 years ago. But large-scale population genetics changes slowly. The ancient signals, the Bell Beaker ancestry and the Anglo-Saxon ancestry, and the traces of the Western hunter-gatherers are still there in the majority of people who can trace their ancestry in Britain for many generations. They persist, not because anyone has preserved them consciously, but because the demographic patterns of previous centuries meant that the population was relatively stable, genetically, even as it was transformed culturally, politically, and economically. And those ancient signals, accumulated over thousands of years of contingent history on a rain-swept island in the North Atlantic, are the reason that someone stepping out of an airport in Amsterdam or Frankfurt or Paris and walking through the crowd might notice. Something in the faces, something in the colouring, something in the physical profile of the people around them that registers as familiar and yet subtly different from home. The English look the way they do because of a story that is 9,000 years old and 4,000 miles deep, because of a lost country beneath the North Sea and a people from Turkey who crossed the Alps, and a herder from the Eurasian steppe who never imagined England, and a fisherman from Schleswig-Holstein who did. Because of all of them, and of everything that happened between them. And that story is worth knowing, worth remembering, worth turning over quietly in the mind on a grey afternoon when the light falls in that specific English way on a face that has been shaped by more history than its bearer will ever fully know. There are questions that remain, questions that the current state of the science cannot yet answer with confidence, and they are some of the most interesting questions in this entire story. They have to do with the period between the end of the Bell Beaker replacement and the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon settlement, the roughly 2,000 years of the British Bronze Age and Iron Age, and with the particular characteristics of the population that emerged from that period. The Bronze Age in Britain was not simply a waiting period between two great genetic disruptions. It was a time of extraordinary cultural achievement, of monument building and metalworking and trade networks that stretched across the known world. It was a time when the population that had descended from the Belbeaker settlers developed its own distinctly British character, shaped by the island's geography and climate and the particular resources available to it. But we are still learning what that population looked like genetically. The ancient DNA record for British Bronze Age populations is improving rapidly, with new studies adding hundreds of individuals from sites across the country, and what they are showing is a picture more complex than early summaries suggested. The Bronze Age British were not genetically homogeneous. There is variation between different regions, between different time periods within the Bronze Age, and between individuals within single sites. Some of this variation reflects gene flow from continental Europe continuing throughout the period. Some of it reflects local processes, the random drift of gene frequencies in smaller communities, differential survival and reproduction of different family groups over the generations. But there is also something that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of continuing selection for specific traits during the Bronze Age. Light pigmentation variants appear to have continued to increase in frequency during the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, even after the initial boost from the Belbeaker steppe ancestry. Whether this reflects continuing selection pressure from the low sunlight British environment or simply drift in a population already skewed heavily toward light pigmentation variants is still being debated. What is clear is that by the time the Iron Age begins, the British population has its own firmly established genetic character, distinct from the Belbeaker founding population because of the 2,000 years of island evolution that have intervened. The Iron Age British that Rome would encounter, Boudica and Caractacus and Cassivellonus and all the rest of the named historical figures of the late Iron Age, were the products of that 2,000-year British evolution. And they were not pale, passive inhabitants of a cold island. The ancient sources describe British warriors with their blue-woad body paint and their fierce independence and their chariot warfare. Archaeology describes elaborate hill forts and fine metalwork and sophisticated agricultural systems. These were complex, capable, culturally rich people, and their descendants are still here in the modern British population, most clearly visible in Wales and the Celtic fringe, but present as a substrate even under the Anglo-Saxon genetic layer in England. There is a poignancy in recognizing that the people who built the great hill forts of southern England, Maiden Castle in Dorset with its elaborate concentric defences, Danebury in Hampshire with its centuries of continuous occupation, South Cadbury in Somerset with its later associations with Arthurian legend, the descendants of those people were partly displaced by the Anglo-Saxon settlement. Their language was lost in most of England. Their political structures were replaced. But their genes were not entirely erased. They persist at different frequencies in different places in the modern English population. And there is something that the genetics cannot yet tell us, something that may be permanently beyond the reach of DNA analysis. What language those Iron Age Britons spoke, how their language and the language of the incoming Anglo-Saxons interacted, whether there was a period of bilingualism before English finally displaced Brittonic Celtic in the areas of densest Anglo-Saxon settlement. The linguistic evidence for this transition is frustratingly sparse. Old English, the language of the Anglo-Saxons, borrowed remarkably few words from the Brittonic Celtic that it replaced in England. The loan words that did make it into Old English are mostly place names and river names and a handful of other geographic terms, suggesting that the cultural contact was real, but that the language contact was not the kind of intimate bilingual situation that typically produces extensive borrowing. The river names of England tell their own story about the linguistic layers: the Thames, the Avon, the Severn, the Exe, the Ouse. These are not English names, and they are not even straightforwardly Celtic names. Some of them, when analysed by historical linguists, point toward a substrate that predates not only Old English, but Celtic itself, a layer of language that was spoken in Britain before the Indo-European languages arrived, before the people we call the Celts gave their name to the cultural complex they represent. This pre-Celtic linguistic substrate is still only partially understood. It may be connected to the language spoken by the Atlantic Bronze Age and Neolithic populations of Britain, the people whose genes are still faintly visible in the modern Welsh and Cornish and Scottish DNA profiles. It survives only in river names and a few place names, in the most conservative part of the linguistic record, the names of water bodies that tend to be preserved longest because they are used by everyone regardless of what language they are speaking. But it is there. It is audible, if you know how to listen, in the names of the rivers that flow through the English countryside. The same rivers whose waters have reflected the faces of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and Neolithic tomb builders and Bronze Age metalworkers and Iron Age warriors and Roman auxiliary soldiers and Anglo-Saxon settlers and Viking traders and Norman lords and medieval peasants and all the people who came after them, right down to the person walking along the riverbank today and looking at their own reflection, without knowing what that reflection carries within it. The story of the English face is a story about rivers and about the names of rivers and about all the people who have stood beside them over 9,000 years and left something behind, in the soil or in the language or in the genetic memory of those who followed them. It is an old story, older than England, older than the English language, older than the island itself, and it is still being written. The latest chapter involves not ancient DNA from burial sites, but the genomes of living people, sequenced as part of projects like the UK Biobank, which has collected genetic and health data from 500,000 British volunteers. Analysing this data in geographical terms has produced maps of British genetic variation that reveal, with startling precision, the fingerprints of the historical events we have been discussing. The Anglo-Saxon settlement is visible in a gradient running from High Germanic ancestry in the east to Lower Germanic ancestry in the west. The Viking contribution is visible in higher Scandinavian ancestry in northern England and the islands. The Celtic fringe shows its older genetic profile clearly. And at the finest resolution, the data shows something even more remarkable. People in Britain today, whose families have been in the same region for many generations, often carry genetic signatures that match the specific ancestral populations that settled their region over 1,000 years ago. The descendants of Anglo-Saxon settlers in Lincolnshire carry more Anglo-Saxon ancestry than the descendants of people who have been in Cornwall for just as long. The descendants of Norse settlers in Orkney carry more Scandinavian ancestry than people from Yorkshire. The deep past is still present in the patterns of modern British genetics. The events of 1,000 or 2,000 years ago are not dissolved by the passage of time. They persist as subtle differences in gene frequency between populations that look broadly similar on the surface. And at the broader scale, the English as a whole sit at their distinctive point in the European genetic landscape, different from the French to their south, and the Scandinavians to their north, and the Germans to their east in ways that reflect the entire extraordinary history we have been tracing. That distinctiveness was not designed, it was not chosen, it was not the result of any conscious policy or any mystical quality of the island or any destiny. It was the result of a series of accidents, of sea level change and climate shifts, and the movements of people who were following their own logic, their own needs, their own opportunities, without any knowledge of what they were building in aggregate. But it is real. It is measurable. It is visible in the faces of people who carry it without knowing why. And it is one of the most extraordinary genetic stories on the planet. A small island that has been transformed more thoroughly, more repeatedly, and in more measurable ways than almost any other piece of land of comparable size on Earth, and that has emerged from those transformations with a population that is, in its own quiet and unpretentious way, a genuinely remarkable genetic archive. There is something that sits at the center of this whole story, something that is easy to miss when you are moving through the genetics and the archaeology and the migration routes, and it is this. Every single one of the people whose genes now flow through the English population was a real person. They were not data points. They were not founding events. They were people with names that we will never know, who had fears we can only imagine, and loves we will never reconstruct, and knowledge of landscapes that no longer exist. The Amesbury archer who travelled from the Alps to die near Stonehenge with his copper knives and his gold ornaments. The person whose bones were found in Guff's cave with their dark skin and their blue eyes, who made tools from flint and hunted deer in the Mendip Hills 9,000 years ago. The Anglo-Saxon settler whose remains were found in a cemetery in Cambridgeshire, with the grave goods that mark the new culture arriving in an old land. The Viking trader whose DNA has been traced through a modern Yorkshireman who thinks of himself as simply English. Each of them lived a complete life. Each of them made choices within their circumstances, loved particular people, feared particular things, knew particular places intimately. And each of them, without knowing it, contributed to the genetic heritage that would eventually produce the English. That is the story that the science tells. Not a story about racial categories or national destinies, a story about contingency and time. About how a specific combination of geological accident and demographic chance produced a population that sits at its own specific place in the human genetic landscape. The English look different from other Europeans because their history was different from other Europeans, because they live on an island that was made by a catastrophe and reshaped by migrations that came in specific directions and in specific sequences that do not quite match what happened anywhere else. And because 9,000 years is a long time, and a lot can happen in 9,000 years on a rainy island in the North Atlantic. The next time you look at a face that you recognize as English, whether in the mirror or in the street or in a painting from 500 years ago, you are looking at the end product of all of this. The geology and the migration and the replacement and the drift and the selection, the lost landmass and the Mesolithic hunter and the Bell Beaker warrior and the Anglo-Saxon settler and the Viking trader, all of them compressed into one face. That face has a story, a long one. And now you know a little more of it. There is still so much more to say about the specific mechanisms by which these ancestral layers interact in the genetics of the modern English, about what particular genes are responsible for specific traits and how those genes behaved in the populations that carried them across these thousands of years. The science of pigmentation genetics alone is a deep and fascinating rabbit hole, and the story of how the specific British combination of light skin and blue eye variants came together is more detailed and more interesting than the summary version suggests. The SLC24A5 gene, which is responsible for one of the key pathways in human skin pigmentation, shows specific patterns in the British population that reflect its history of introduction through multiple migration waves. The derived form of this gene, which produces lighter skin, appears to have been introduced into Britain primarily through the Anatolian Neolithic migration and was then reinforced by the steppe-derived Bell Beaker ancestry. But the frequency in the English population today is higher than would be expected from either founding event alone, suggesting that selection for lighter skin has continued to operate in the British population for the entire period since the Neolithic. The HERC2 and OCA2 genes, which control blue eye pigmentation, show a different pattern. The derived variant that produces blue eyes appears to have originated much earlier, possibly in the Western hunter-gatherer population of Mesolithic Europe, and was carried into Britain both through the surviving hunter-gatherer ancestry in the Bell Beaker population and through the Anglo-Saxon immigration. The frequency of blue eyes in Britain today is the result of multiple routes by which this variant arrived and accumulated. What is particularly interesting is that the genes for pale skin and blue eyes are not genetically linked in any direct way. You can have pale skin without blue eyes, and you can have blue eyes without pale skin. The fact that both are unusually common in the English population is not because they were selected together or introduced together as a single package, but because they arrived through the same series of migration events from northern European populations that tended to carry both variants at high frequencies. This independence of the two traits means that their co-occurrence in the English population is, at one level, coincidental. Both pale skin variants and blue eye variants were at high frequencies in the populations that settled Britain most heavily. Both accumulated further through island drift and continued selection, but they did so through partly separate genetic mechanisms, and their present co-occurrence in the English population is the result of their parallel histories, rather than any necessary biological connection. This matters for understanding why the English look different from other Europeans. It is not that there is some single gene or some single biological package that produces the English phenotype. It is that multiple independent traits, each with its own specific history, were all pushed in the same direction by the same series of demographic events. The result looks like a coherent package because the historical pressures were coherent, not because the biology was linked. And there are other traits beyond pigmentation that show the same pattern. Height, as we have discussed, was influenced by the steppe ancestry introduction. Certain facial structure traits, including aspects of jaw shape and forehead profile and nose form, show distributions in British populations that partially reflect the founding population genetics and partially reflect subsequent drift. These are subtle differences, not the dramatic discontinuities of obviously distinct populations, but measurable differences that a physical anthropologist can detect and that a casual observer can sometimes intuit. The jawline in particular has been a subject of some interest in this context. The bell beaker populations of the early Bronze Age show distinctive cranial morphology in the archaeological record, including certain jaw and cranial vault characteristics that differ from the Neolithic British that preceded them. These characteristics, or some of them, appear to have persisted in the British population and to contribute to the specific facial appearance of modern British and specifically English people. This is the kind of evidence that is difficult to discuss without it sounding like the kind of racial typology that did enormous damage in the 20th century. And it is important to be clear about the distinction. What physical anthropologists are measuring are statistical distributions across large populations, not categories into which individuals are sorted. There is no English face in the sense of a single type. There is a distribution of faces in the English population that differs in measurable ways from the distribution of faces in, say, the French or German or Italian population. These differences are real and scientifically measurable, but they tell us about population history, not about individual identity or value. What they tell us, in aggregate, is exactly what the genetic data tells us, that the English population has a specific history that has produced a specific and recognizable profile, different in subtle but measurable ways from the profiles of other European populations, and explicable entirely in terms of the sequence of geological events and demographic events that we have been tracing throughout this story. The genetic science of the last 20 years has made it possible to tell this story with a precision that was simply not available to earlier generations of researchers. Ancient DNA analysis was not possible at all until the 1980s and was not capable of producing the kind of high-quality genomic data we now rely on until very recently. The explosion of data from British ancient DNA sites, which has accelerated dramatically in the last decade as sequencing costs have fallen and analytical methods have improved, has completely transformed our understanding of British prehistory. We now know, with a degree of confidence that would have seemed impossible to scholars of the previous generation, that the bell beaker replacement was real and was enormous in scale. We know that the Anglo-Saxon genetic contribution was substantial and geographically variable. We know that the Neolithic replacement of the Mesolithic population was nearly complete. We know that the Roman period left a surprisingly small genetic footprint. We know that the Norman conquest left an even smaller one. These are not small revisions to an existing picture. They are transformative reframings of how we understand British prehistory and the origins of the English people. The history that was taught in schools a generation ago, the history of Anglo-Saxon invasion replacing Romano-British culture, was broadly right about the cultural and linguistic transformation, but underestimated the scale of the genetic transformation. The story of Roman Britain being a cosmopolitan multicultural society was and is true in cultural and military terms, but does not translate into a dramatic genetic legacy. The Bell Beaker Revolution, which barely featured in popular accounts of British prehistory a generation ago, turns out to have been the single most transformative demographic event in the island's history since it became an island. And the Mesolithic inhabitants of Britain, the dark-skinned, blue-eyed hunter-gatherers, whose existence Cheddarman brought dramatically to public attention, have turned out to be far more interesting and far more deeply rooted than anyone imagined. Their persistence in the Atlantic fringe, their contribution to the Bell Beaker founding population, the traces of their language in the river names of England. These are discoveries that are still being fully integrated into the story. We are, in a very real sense, in the middle of a revolution in our understanding of who the English are and where they came from. The revolution is being driven by technology, by ancient DNA sequencing and population genetics analysis, but it is illuminating questions that historians and anthropologists and curious people have been asking for a very long time. Why do the English look the way they do? Where did the people of this island come from? What is the relationship between the genetic inheritance and the cultural inheritance, between the DNA in British bodies and the history that those bodies have lived through? The answers are still being refined, new data is still being generated, new sites are being excavated, and new genomes are being sequenced, and new analytical methods are being applied to old questions. Each new study adds another layer of detail, confirms some things, complicates others, and opens new avenues of inquiry. But the broad outlines are now clear enough to tell the story with confidence, and that story is one of the most extraordinary stories in European history. A story of a small island that has been transformed more thoroughly than perhaps any other comparable piece of land, through a sequence of geological and demographic events that each seemed, to the people living through them, like simply the world as it was, a catastrophic sea level rise that was just the water level where they lived. A new people arriving who were just neighbours, at first, and then more than neighbours. A replacement that left no memory, only traces in the soil. That is the story of why the English look different from every other European. It is a story about deep time and about contingency, and about the way that everything we think is permanent and stable is actually the product of a sequence of accidents, any one of which could have been different, and if different would have produced a different story. The same grey light falls on the same grey sea. The same rain comes in off the Atlantic in sheets and clouds that have been rolling in this direction since before there was an English channel to cross. The faces that turn up to receive it carry 9,000 years of history in their colouring, in the specific distribution of pigment that is the end product of a story that begins under 50 metres of cold North Sea water in a landscape that was drowned before Egypt built its first pyramid. Every face is an archive. Every face is a story. You just needed someone to tell you what language it was written in. Tonight, wherever you are listening from, whether you are in a house in Yorkshire, or a flat in London, or a room somewhere on the other side of the world, where English voices carry across the airwaves, and the internet and the long, complicated history of this island has left its mark in a different way, tonight you know a little more about what that face means, about what it carries, about the journey it has been on to arrive at this moment. The Mesolithic hunter on the banks of a river in what would become Somerset did not know that the sea was going to rise and take the world they knew. The Bell Beaker archer, who crossed the channel 4,500 years ago, did not know that the people they were meeting, and in some cases replacing, would leave so little genetic trace, and that their own genes would be so dominant in the people who came after. The Anglo-Saxon settler on the Suffolk coast did not know that they were founding a nation. The Viking trader in York did not know that their descendants would be speaking a version of their language 1,000 years later. None of them knew the story they were in. We have the privilege of knowing a little more of it than they did. Not all of it, not even most of it, but a little more. And that little more is a gift, paid for by the patient work of scientists and archaeologists and historians who have spent their careers asking the same questions that humans have always asked. Where did we come from, and what does it mean? It means this, all of it. 9,000 years and counting, still flowing. Rest now. The story is old enough to wait until morning. If this journey through time helped carry you toward sleep, a gentle tap on the like button helps more than you might expect. And if you would like to keep traveling through these hidden histories, through the layers of the past that most textbooks barely mention, subscribing means we will have these conversations again. I would love to know where you are tonight. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. A city, a country, whatever you want to share. Someone in Cape Town, and someone in Glasgow, and someone in Manila, and someone in a small town in rural England, all of them hearing the same old story at the same moment. That still strikes me as something worth noting. For those who want to support this channel in a deeper way, membership is there as an option, completely without pressure. These stories will always be here, whether you join or not. For now, there is nothing you need to do. Just let the weight of all those thousands of years settle gently around you. The North Sea is where it always was. The rain is doing what it always does. And the faces in the street tomorrow carry all the history you now know. Good night. There is a particular kind of light that falls on Britain in late afternoon in autumn, a low golden light that comes at an angle, too shallow to warm anything but illuminates everything with a quality that painters have been trying to capture for centuries, and that still escapes the camera, in the same way that the real thing always slightly escapes any reproduction of it. It falls on the chalk downs of southern England, and on the red sandstone cliffs of Devon, and on the dark wet slate of the Welsh mountains, and on the grey granite of the Scottish Highlands. And each landscape takes it differently, turns it according to its own specific material, sends it back in its own particular way. People who have lived in Britain for a long time, or who grew up there and then left, tend to describe this light with an emotion that is not quite nostalgia and not quite beauty and not quite belonging. It is something more specific than any of those things, something that seems to involve not just memory, but recognition, the feeling of seeing something that is native to you in a way that goes deeper than experience. This feeling, if you have had it, is not imaginary, and it is not sentimental. It is, in some sense, biological. Human visual systems are calibrated to the light environments in which they develop, and to the light environments in which their ancestors developed over many generations. The specific quality of British light, the angle and diffusion and colour temperature that are determined by the island's latitude and weather patterns and the particular quality of its atmosphere, has been the visual environment of the people living here for 9,000 years. They evolved in it and adapted to it, and their perceptions were shaped by it. This is one of the more poetic expressions of the same principle that underlies everything we have been discussing. The English, and the British more broadly, are adapted to this island in ways that go well beyond genetics. They are adapted to its light and its weather, and its soils, and its particular disease environment, and its specific seasonal rhythms. And those adaptations have been accumulating for the entire period of habitation, 9,000 years of this particular island, shaping the people who live on it. The genetic distinctiveness we have been tracing is the most measurable expression of that adaptation. The pale skin that synthesizes vitamin D efficiently in low sunlight conditions. The specific immune profiles shaped by the island's disease history. The height distribution that reflects the founding population's ancestry and the island's nutritional environment over millennia. These are not arbitrary or coincidental. They are the results of natural selection operating on the specific conditions of island life in the North Atlantic, working on the raw material provided by the sequence of founding populations. But the adaptation is broader than genetics. The culture that has developed on this island, the specific way that English people relate to their landscape, the particular forms of humour and understatement and reserve that characterize English social interaction, the passion for gardening and walking in the countryside and talking about the weather. These, too, are adaptations, cultural rather than genetic, shaped by the specific conditions of life on this island over long periods of time. The English relationship with their weather, for instance, which is famous enough to have become a cliché about English personality, is not simply a quirk. It is a deeply rational response to an environment in which the weather is genuinely important, genuinely variable, and genuinely impossible to ignore. For a farming population, weather determines survival. For a maritime population, weather determines safety. For a population living in a climate where the difference between a good summer and a bad one can mean the difference between a comfortable winter and a hungry one, the weather deserves the attention that English people give it. This cultural adaptation runs alongside the genetic adaptation and is related to it. The same island geography that produced specific selection pressures on the genetics also produced specific selection pressures on the culture. The channel that separated Britain from continental Europe and gave the population its distinctive genetic trajectory also shaped the distinctive cultural trajectory, the particular insularity and independence and self-sufficiency that characterize British culture at its best. And the language itself is a form of this adaptation. English, as a language, is the product of all the same historical forces that produced the English genetic profile. It carries within it the Old English base that the Anglo-Saxon migrants brought, modified by the Norse vocabulary that the Vikings added, transformed by the Norman French that the conquest imposed, and then shaped over 1,000 years of island development into the distinctive form that exists today. A language that is simultaneously deeply Germanic in its core structure and deeply French in much of its vocabulary, and deeply itself in a way that neither ancestor can explain. The English language is, in its own way, exactly what the English gene pool is, a specific mixture of ingredients from multiple sources, combined in a specific way over a specific period of time, in a specific place, to produce something that is genuinely distinct from any of its components. When you speak English, you are speaking the linguistic equivalent of the English genetic profile. You are speaking a language that carries 900 years of Norman French and 1,000 years of Old English, and the traces of Viking contact and the faint substrate of something older still, in a form that no other country speaks in quite the same way. It is the sound of all those migrations, compressed and transformed and made into something new. That is a thought worth carrying with you as you drift toward sleep. The language you are hearing right now is itself a record of the same history that the genetics records. The words are the fossils of the people who brought them, and the history that is embedded in the language is the history that is embedded in the faces of the people who speak it. Let us take a moment to look more closely at the Atlantic connection that keeps surfacing in this story, because it is one of the parts of British prehistory that is least well understood and most fascinating. Throughout the periods we have been discussing, Britain was not simply connected to continental Europe through the Channel and the North Sea. It was also connected to the Atlantic world, to Ireland and to the western coasts of France and to the Iberian Peninsula, and, in ways that are still being worked out, to even more distant places. The Atlantic was not a barrier in the ancient world, it was a highway. The Atlantic Bronze Age, which is the name given to the connected culture that flourished along the Atlantic coast of Europe from roughly 1300 to 700 BCE, provides some of the clearest evidence for this. During this period, metal objects of recognizably similar types appear all the way from Portugal to Scotland and Ireland. Swords and spearheads and axes of specific forms that indicate shared production traditions and probably shared networks of craftspeople and traders. Amber and tin and copper and gold moving along the Atlantic coast in both directions, connecting communities that spoke different languages and lived in different climates and were separated by hundreds or thousands of miles of open ocean. Britain was deeply integrated into this Atlantic Bronze Age network. The tin that came from Cornwall and southwest England was essential to the bronze production of the entire Atlantic zone. British metalworkers were among the most skilled producers in the network. British communities received goods from Iberia and Ireland and Brittany in return. The Atlantic was busy with traffic, and that traffic was carrying not only objects, but people and ideas and genes. The Atlantic Bronze Age connection helps explain some of the genetic patterns that are visible in modern British populations. The sharing of certain ancestry components between British and Irish and Western French and Iberian populations is partly a result of this Bronze Age connectivity, people moving back and forth along the Atlantic coast and leaving genetic traces at every stop. It also helps explain a phenomenon that physical anthropologists have noted for a long time: the existence of what used to be called the Atlantic type, a specific physical profile observed at higher frequencies in populations along the Atlantic fringe of Europe, from Ireland and western Scotland and Wales through Brittany and into Iberia. This profile is characterized by certain skull measurements, certain height and build distributions, certain pigmentation patterns that distinguish it from populations in Central and Eastern Europe. Modern genetics has both confirmed and complicated the old Atlantic type concept. Yes, there is something real being described, a shared ancestry component in Atlantic fringe populations that is distinct from the ancestry components of interior continental Europe. But it is not a single thing, not a single population, or a single migration. It is the result of multiple overlapping processes. Shared Mesolithic Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, shared Neolithic farmer ancestry from the Atlantic route of the farming expansion, Bronze Age exchange and migration along the coast, and the partial protection from later steppe-derived migrations that all these coastal populations shared. The English are connected to this Atlantic world, particularly through the Bell Beaker population, whose ancestors had been part of the Atlantic Bronze Age network for centuries before the migration into Britain. And the parts of Britain most thoroughly integrated into the Atlantic world, the western and northern fringes, retain the highest proportions of this Atlantic ancestry in the modern population. There is a particular poignancy to the Cornish, who speak, or spoke until recently, a Celtic language that is more closely related to Breton across the Channel than it is to Welsh just to the north, who have maintained a distinct cultural identity in their peninsula for a very long time, and whose genetic profile shows some of the highest levels of Atlantic and pre-Anglo-Saxon British ancestry in England. The Cornish are, in a very real sense, living in the overlap between the English Atlantic and the continental Atlantic, preserving connections that go back to the Bronze Age and beyond. And Ireland, just across the water from Wales and Scotland, is itself one of the most genetically interesting populations in Europe, for precisely the same reasons. The Irish received the Bell Beaker migrants and were transformed by them. They received some Viking influence along their eastern coast. They received the Norman plantation of the medieval period. But they were spared the Anglo-Saxon settlement that so thoroughly transformed lowland England. The result is a genetic profile that preserves the pre-Anglo-Saxon British inheritance more completely than most English populations do. When modern Irish people note that they feel different from the English, or when the English feel different from the Irish despite their obvious shared history and geographical proximity, they are not wrong. The difference is real, and it is measurable. It is the genetic echo of the Anglo-Saxon settlement that separated the two islands' demographic trajectories 1,500 years ago. The relationship between the Irish and British genetic profiles and what that relationship tells us about the deeper history of the islands is itself a fascinating research area. Both populations share the Bell Beaker inheritance. Both share the traces of Neolithic farmer ancestry and Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancestry. Both have their own specific layers of subsequent migration. But they diverged at the Anglo-Saxon moment, and that divergence is still visible today. Now let us take the story in a slightly different direction, because there is an aspect of the English genetic distinctiveness that we have not yet fully explored, one that involves not the origins of traits, but the maintenance of them, and that touches on questions about evolutionary selection that are still actively debated. Why have the traits that characterize the English, the very pale skin and the high frequency of blue eyes, and the specific height distribution and the distinctive immune profiles, been maintained at such high frequencies for so long? Natural selection does not typically maintain traits at high frequency unless they provide some advantage, or unless the founding effect was so strong and the population so isolated that drift alone can explain the persistence. For skin pigmentation, the answer is probably a combination of both. The selection pressure for light skin in a low sunlight environment is real, as we have discussed. Vitamin D synthesis is more efficient in pale skin at low light levels, and vitamin D deficiency has serious health consequences, including rickets, immune dysfunction, and complications in pregnancy. These are the kinds of health penalties that natural selection acts on strongly. So there has been genuine selection for lighter skin in the British population throughout its history. But the vitamin D argument does not fully explain why Britain should be at the extreme end of the European pigmentation distribution. Scandinavia has similar latitude and similar vitamin D selection pressure, and Scandinavian populations are indeed among the palest in the world. But the English are not quite as far toward the pale end as the Scandinavians, and the Welsh are slightly darker on average than the English, and the distribution within England shows north-south and east-west clines that suggest multiple historical influences layered on top of each other. The complexity of the pigmentation distribution in Britain is, in fact, one of the best illustrations of the complexity of the demographic history we have been tracing. Different regions of Britain received different mixes of the migration waves at different times and in different proportions, and those different mixes produced different average pigmentation profiles. The East is slightly lighter on average, reflecting the heavier Anglo-Saxon influence. The West and North are slightly darker, reflecting the greater preservation of the pre-Anglo-Saxon British ancestry. The gradient is subtle but measurable, and there is one more selective force worth mentioning, one that is specific to island populations, and that has been proposed as part of the explanation for British pigmentation patterns: sexual selection. In small island populations, mate choice preferences can accumulate more quickly than in large continental populations because the pool of potential mates is smaller and the preferences have more consistent reinforcement. If there is any tendency, even a slight one, for individuals in a population to prefer lighter-eyed or lighter-skinned partners, that preference can drive trait frequencies upward over many generations, particularly in a partly isolates population. The evidence for sexual selection on pigmentation traits in European populations is still contested, but it has been proposed as a contributing factor in several contexts, and Britain's island status makes it potentially more relevant here than in continental populations. This is one of the genuinely open questions in British genetics. We can document the trait distributions. We can document the historical events that shaped the founding populations. We can measure the current frequencies and see how they vary geographically. But the precise balance between natural selection for vitamin D synthesis and founder effects from the migration waves and island drift and possible sexual selection is something that the science is still working out. What we can say with confidence is that the result is a population at the distinctive point in the European pigmentation distribution that we observe, and that this distinctiveness is not an accident, but the product of real forces operating on a real population over a long period of time. The same caveat applies throughout this story. The English do not look the way they do by chance, in the sense that the specific combination of forces that produced their genetic profile was not random. But they do look the way they do by contingency, in the sense that if any of the key events had been different, the outcome would have been different. If the Storiga tsunami had been larger or smaller, if the Bell Beaker migration had been smaller in scale, if the Anglo-Saxon settlement had been more evenly distributed across the island, if the island had been reconnected to continental Europe at some point during the medieval warm period. If any of these things had been different, the English would be different. The contingency of the outcome is one of the most important things to hold on to in understanding this story, because it cuts against every form of genetic essentialism. There is nothing necessary or inevitable about the English genetic profile. It is the result of a series of events that could have happened otherwise, and that in other parts of the world did happen otherwise, producing different outcomes. The French are not more or less complete Europeans than the English. The Germans are not more or less complete Europeans than either. All of these populations are the products of their own specific histories, their own specific sequences of migration and selection and drift. The English version of that story is particularly interesting, partly because of the unusual sequence of large-scale replacements and partly because of the island geography that amplified their effects. But interesting is not the same as superior, and distinctive is not the same as better. The science of human population genetics has been misused so badly throughout history, and particularly in the 20th century, that it is important to say this clearly and often. What the genetics tells us is history. It does not tell us hierarchy. The people with the highest frequencies of any particular gene variant are not in any way superior to people with different frequencies of the same variant. They are simply the products of a different historical sequence, shaped by different environments and different events. With that clear, we can return to the story with the enthusiasm it deserves, because it really is an extraordinary story. Consider the chain of causation that runs from the Storegga tsunami to the faces you see in a Manchester street today. A submarine landslide off the Norwegian coast 8,000 years ago generated a wave that accelerated the flooding of Doggerland. That flooding isolated Britain as an island and created the conditions for the genetic drift and insulation that characterize subsequent British demographic history. The isolation meant that when the Belbeca migrants arrived, their genes were not mixed back into continental European gene pools as quickly as they might have been in a more connected territory. The isolation meant that the Anglo-Saxon settlement, when it came, transformed a more distinct British population and itself became more insulated from subsequent continental mixing. And so on, through the Vikings and the Normans and the medieval period. The Storegga tsunami is not usually cited as an important event in English history. It predates England by 8,000 years. But in a real sense, it is one of the founding events of the English population, because it created the conditions that made everything else possible in the specific way it happened. This is what deep time does to causal chains. It reveals connections between events that seem utterly unrelated in their own time, but that are, in retrospect, part of the same sequence. The Norwegian submarine landslide and the blue eyes of a person in Norwich. The collapse of Roman imperial power and the Germanic ancestry of a family in Lincolnshire. The Yamnaya, herders of the Pontic steppe, and the fair complexion of a child in Yorkshire. All connected, all part of the same long, strange story. The river names of England are perhaps the most haunting expression of this deep connectivity. When you drive across the Midlands and cross the River Avon, you are crossing a waterway whose name comes from a Brittonic Celtic word, aphon, meaning river, a word that predates the English language by well over 1,000 years. When you cross the River Exe in Devon or the River Axe in Somerset, you are crossing rivers whose names come from a British word, isca, meaning water, that was already ancient when the Romans arrived and borrowed it to name the city of Isca Dumnoniorum, which became Exeter. But go deeper still. Some river names in Britain, when analysed by historical linguists, appear to be even older than the attested Celtic languages. Names like the Thames, which has been connected to a root meaning dark or murky water in forms that appear across ancient Indo-European languages. Names like the Exe and the Axe, that may go back to an even older water word than the attested Celtic athon or isca. These are possible traces of languages spoken in Britain before the Celtic languages arrived, languages spoken by the people who built the megalithic monuments and who are only now beginning to emerge from the silence of the genetic record. When you hear the name of the Thames, you may be hearing an echo of a language spoken 4,000 or 5,000 years ago by people whose DNA is faintly preserved in the modern Welsh and Cornish and Scottish populations, people who were here before the Celts and whose language, like their genetics, was mostly replaced, but not entirely erased. The river names are the most conservative part of the linguistic record, because water bodies tend to hold their names through population changes in ways that other landscape features do not. New settlers may rename the villages and the fields and the hills, but they tend to adopt the names of the rivers, because the rivers are the most important geographic features, and their names are already in use, and it is easier to adopt a name than to invent a new one. This means that the rivers of England are named in a succession of different languages, laid down over thousands of years, and if you listen to them carefully, you can hear the layers. The English place names of the Anglo-Saxon settlers, mostly on the map of settlements and farmsteads. The Scandinavian place names of the Viking settlers, concentrated in the north and east. The British Celtic place names that survived the Anglo-Saxon period, mostly in the west and north and in the names of the major rivers. And beneath all of them, the oldest names, the ones that the linguists argue about in terms of their ultimate origin, the ones that may be the voice of people who lived here before anyone we can name. The landscape speaks, if you know how to listen. And in a way, all of this, the genetic evidence and the linguistic evidence, and the archaeological evidence and the geological evidence is converging on the same story from different directions. A story about a place that has been inhabited for a very long time and has been transformed repeatedly and has maintained certain continuities through all those transformations. Continuities that are visible then in the faces of the people and the names of the rivers and the patterns in the DNA. That convergence is part of what makes the story satisfying, even though it is also what makes it complex. There is no single simple answer to the question of why the English look the way they do, because the question leads down into such depths of time and such complexity of cause. But the depth and the complexity are themselves the answer. The English look the way they do because their history is deep and complex and layered in ways that no simple story can capture. And that depth is something worth knowing, worth sitting with, worth taking into the understanding of what it means to be from this place, or connected to this place, or interested in this place. The faces in the street are archives. The rivers carry old names, the soil holds old bones, and all of it is connected to the present moment, to the specific configuration of genes and expressions that constitutes the English population today, in ways that are only now becoming visible. There is one more part of this story that deserves attention before we let the night settle around it, and that is the question of what we do not know and what we may never know. The genetic record, impressive as it is incomplete. Ancient DNA is preserved best in cold, dry conditions, in bones from caves and sealed chambers and northern latitudes. The hot, wet conditions of much of England are not favourable to DNA preservation, and large areas of the archaeological landscape have yielded little or no ancient DNA despite extensive excavation. The Bronze Age and Iron Age sites of southern England, which are the sites most directly relevant to understanding the pre-Anglo-Saxon British genetic profile, are among the most challenging for DNA preservation. This means that our picture of the genetic history of Britain is built from a sample that is uneven and in some periods and regions very sparse. The conclusions we draw are valid within the limits of the data, but those limits are real. New data may confirm what the current evidence suggests, but it may also reveal significant gaps or complications in the current picture. For example, the question of exactly how complete the Belbeka replacement of the Neolithic British population was, and whether it differed significantly in different regions, is still being refined as new data comes in. Early estimates suggested replacement of 80 to 90%, but those estimates were based on relatively small samples from specific regions. As the sample grows to include more sites from more parts of Britain, the picture may become more nuanced. Similarly, the question of what exactly happened at the Mesolithic to Neolithic transition, and whether there was more persistence of hunter-gatherer genes in some regions than early studies suggested, is still open. The early picture of near-complete replacement of the hunter-gatherers by incoming farmers is probably broadly correct, but the details of that transition, the timing and the geography and the specific mechanisms are still being worked out, and the deepest questions about the Western hunter-gatherer population and the Atlantic megalithic ancestry and the possible pre-Celtic linguistic substrate are the ones for which the data is thinnest and the uncertainty highest. These are the areas where our knowledge is most incomplete and where new discoveries are most likely to change the picture significantly. There is also the question of what we cannot know from genetics at all. The genetics can tell us about ancestry, about migration routes, about selection pressures on measurable biological traits. It cannot tell us what language people spoke, what they believed, how they organized their societies, what they thought about the world. For those questions, we depend on the archaeological record and the linguistic record and the comparison with better documented cultures, and all of those sources have their own severe limitations when we are talking about populations that predated writing by thousands of years. The people who built Stonehenge are present in the ancient DNA record. We can reconstruct aspects of their genetic ancestry. We can see that they were predominantly of Anatolian Neolithic descent. We can estimate their pigmentation and their stature and their immune profiles. But we cannot hear what they said when they gathered at the monument. We cannot know what the monument meant to them. We cannot know the names they gave to the landscape features around them, or the stories they told about the stones. That silence is the price of deep time. The further back you go, the more the evidence thins, until you are left with bones and stones and the analysis of ancient DNA, and the imagination must do the rest. But the imagination, informed by all of this evidence, can produce something more than fantasy. It can produce a picture of the deep past that is grounded in the best available evidence, that acknowledges its uncertainties, and that gives the people of the past the dignity of being recognized as real people, rather than as data points or demographic abstractions. The Mesolithic hunter in Gough's Cave was a real person. Their dark skin and blue eyes were real traits carried in a real body that lived a real life. The Bell-Beaker archer, buried near Stonehenge with his gold and his copper, was a real person who had travelled a long way and who died far from where he was born. The Anglo-Saxon settler on the Suffolk coast was a real person who was part of a movement of people that would transform the landscape they arrived in, without knowing that was what they were doing. Each of them was as real and as full of interior life as you are, lying there in the dark, listening to this story about all of them. Each of them was an entire world of experience and memory and relationship, most of which we will never know. What we can know is their genetic legacy, which is one small part of what they were, but a part that has persisted when everything else is gone. That genetic legacy flows through the people of England and Wales and Scotland and Ireland today, in varying proportions and combinations, shaped by all the events we have been discussing and by many that we have not had time to mention. It is the foundation on which everything else has been built. All the culture and the language and the art and the humour and the history that we associate with these islands. And it is still there, 9,000 years deep, still flowing. The North Sea is where it always was. The Dogger Bank rises toward the surface of the water, the highest point of a drowned country, covered by 50 meters of cold, dark water. Somewhere in that darkness, in the sediment of the seafloor, there are the traces of people who lived there before the water came. Their tools are there, pulled up occasionally in fishing nets. Their animals are there, the bones of aurochs and deer that they hunted on a landscape that is now an ocean. The record of their existence is in the seafloor and in the DNA of people alive today. Traces too small to see but real enough to read. That is the oldest layer, the very beginning of the story that ends in the English face. 9,000 years and 50 meters of seawater. It is very far away, and it is never entirely gone. As you close your eyes now, you might let that thought settle around you, like the darkness itself, that you are the end point of a story that long, that your face, or the face you see in the people around you, is the compressed record of 9,000 years of this particular island, this particular sequence of events, this particular combination of geology and climate and migration and selection and drift. That somewhere in the deep architecture of your body, if your ancestry is connected to this island at any point in its long history, there are echoes of people whose names are lost, and whose language is lost, and whose world is buried under the North Sea, but whose genetic contribution is still present, still flowing, still part of what you are. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, an astonishing thing. An island at the edge of Europe, battered by Atlantic weather, transformed so thoroughly and so repeatedly that the people living here today are genetically different from any of the founding populations who came before, and yet connected to all of them through an unbroken chain of inheritance, stretching back through the ice and through the flood and through the ancient pre-island time when the world was different and the landscape was continuous and the North Sea had not yet happened. You carry that within you, whether you know it or not. Now you know it a little more. Sleep well. The story will still be there in the morning, 9,000 years deep in the ground, waiting for the next question, patient as the sea. If tonight's story helped carry you toward rest, a quiet like on this video helps more than you might think. It tells the algorithm to show these stories to other people who might want to hear them in the dark. If you would like to keep walking through these hidden histories, through the genetics and the geology and the deep time that most textbooks barely mention, subscribing means we will do this again. And I would genuinely love to know where you are listening from tonight. Leave it in the comments if you feel moved. Someone under a duvet in Edinburgh, and someone at a desk in Wellington, and someone on a train in Germany, and someone in a city that did not exist when this story begins. All of us connected through the same strange thread. For those who would like to support this channel more directly, membership is there as an option, with no pressure at all attached to it. These stories will always be here. For now, there is nothing required of you. Just the dark, and the quiet, and the very long story of where you came from. Good night. Let us return to something that deserves much more than the brief mention it received earlier. The question of what the Neolithic transformation of Britain actually looked like on the ground. Not as a demographic abstraction or a genetic replacement percentage, but as a lived reality for the people experiencing it. The Neolithic farmers who arrived in Britain around 4000 BCE did not arrive all at once. They did not appear on the coast one morning and begin marching inland. The process was gradual, spread over centuries, and it happened differently in different parts of the island. In some areas, the transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural economy appears to have been rapid, with the farming culture displacing or absorbing the Mesolithic inhabitants within a few generations. In other areas, the transition was slower, and there is some archaeological evidence for what might have been coexistence, for a period at least, between incoming farmers and existing hunter-gatherers. The Long Barrows are the most visible surviving monuments of the Neolithic period in Britain. These great earthen mounds, sometimes stretching for dozens of meters, were used as communal tombs, houses of the dead in a very literal sense, places where the bones of the community were gathered and stored in stone chambers that opened off a central passage or flanked the entrance. They are found across southern England and Wales and Scotland, hundreds of them. Their large grass-covered profiles, a familiar feature of the British chalklands and uplands. What they tell us about the people who built them is partial but fascinating. The dead placed in them were not random selections of the population. In many cases, the skeletal evidence suggests that only certain individuals were accorded burial in the Long Barrow, possibly important or high-status members of the community. The bones were often moved, rearranged, mixed together in ways that suggest the Long Barrow was used over multiple generations and that the bones of the earlier dead were reorganized to make room for the later ones. The dead were not simply buried and forgotten. They were maintained, tended, kept as a community of ancestors within the monument. The genetics of the Neolithic Long Barrow populations has been one of the most productive areas of ancient DNA research in Britain. Dozens of individuals from Long Barrows across Britain have now been sequenced, and they show the expected pattern. Predominantly Anatolian Neolithic ancestry, with only occasional and small contributions from Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. These were the descendants of the farming migration, people who had come from continental Europe carrying the agricultural package. But they were not simply transplanted continental Europeans. After a few centuries in Britain, the Neolithic British population had developed its own specific character, adapting to the British climate and landscape, developing their own specific version of the Neolithic cultural package. The pottery styles of Neolithic Britain are distinct from those of continental Europe. The monument forms are distinct, the Long Barrow being a particularly British elaboration of a more widely distributed megalithic tradition. The patterns of land use, the specific crops grown and animals kept, show adaptation to British conditions. These people were becoming British in the sense of developing a culture and a genetic identity specific to this island, even as they were being replaced by yet another wave of migrants a few centuries after they had established themselves. This is the rhythm that runs through all of British prehistory: arrival, adaptation, establishment, replacement. Each group that came to Britain brought something new, adapted it to the island, developed a specific British version of it, and was then transformed or replaced by the next wave. The end product, the modern English, carries the traces of all these cycles, each one compressed and stratified and preserved in the genetic and cultural archive of the island. The Stonehenge sequence illustrates this rhythm almost perfectly. The earliest phase of Stonehenge, the circular bank and ditch that was dug around 3100 BCE, was the work of the Neolithic farmers, the Anatolian-descended population. The bluestones transported from the Preseli Hills in Wales were erected around 2500 BCE, roughly contemporary with the Bell Beaker arrival and possibly overlapping with the transition between the two populations. The Great Sarsen Circle and Trilithons, the stones that most people picture when they think of Stonehenge, were erected around 2500 to 2000 BCE, almost certainly by the Bell Beaker population or their immediate descendants. The final modifications to the monument, the rearrangements of the smaller stones, and the construction of various additional features continued through the Bronze Age. Stonehenge therefore spans at least two, possibly three, of the major genetic transitions we have been discussing. Its construction history is a physical record of population change in Britain. The people who dug the original earthwork and the people who erected the Great Trilithons were, in all probability, not closely related. They were of different ancestry, speaking different languages, living in different cultural frameworks. But they shared the same landscape and, in some sense, the same monumental tradition. The second group inheriting and continuing the monument that the first group had begun. This kind of cultural continuity across genetic discontinuity is one of the more philosophically interesting findings of the ancient DNA revolution. It suggests that what we think of as cultural inheritance and what we think of as genetic inheritance are not the same thing and do not always move together. The Bell Beaker people who took over Stonehenge were not the genetic descendants of the people who began it, but they valued it enough to continue it, to invest enormous effort in its elaboration, to make it the center of a landscape of monuments that their descendants would maintain for another 1,000 years. Cultural inheritance can jump genetic boundaries. Ideas and practices and sacred places can be adopted by people who share no ancestry with those who created them. This is perhaps obvious in the modern world, where people of every genetic background participate in traditions that originated among people very unlike them genetically. But it is a significant finding in the prehistoric context, because it complicates any simple equation between ancestry and culture. The Bell Beaker people of Britain were not the biological children of the Neolithic builders of Stonehenge, but in some meaningful sense, they inherited it. And the modern English, who carry Bell Beaker ancestry as their dominant genetic signal, also inherited it. Stonehenge is theirs in the same way that Stonehenge belonged to the Bell Beaker people who enlarged it, not by direct biological descent from its creators, but by occupying the landscape in which it stands and finding meaning in its presence. This thought extends to the entire cultural heritage of Britain. The long barrows and the hill forts and the Roman roads and the medieval cathedrals and the Industrial Revolution and the modern cities are all, in a real sense, the inheritance of the people living in Britain today, regardless of what specific genetic heritage they carry. Culture is not genetic. It is transmitted through living in a place, through education and experience, and the accumulated practices of the community. What genetics can tell us is where the bodies came from. It cannot tell us where the ideas came from, or what the people believed, or what their lives meant to them. Those questions require the archaeological and historical and comparative evidence, all of which is incomplete, all of which is being actively researched, all of which is still yielding surprising results. The discovery that Stonehenge was built in multiple phases by genetically distinct populations was one such surprise. The discovery that the bluestones came from Wales and were transported over 200 miles, possibly by water, at least part of the way, was another. The discovery that the landscape around Stonehenge in the Neolithic period was already a heavily modified cultural landscape with hundreds of monuments and earthworks of various kinds was another. Each discovery adds depth to the picture without completing it. The picture will never be complete because the evidence is fragmentary and the people are gone. But it will get better, incrementally, as new techniques are applied to old problems and new excavations yield new data. What we have now is enough to tell a coherent story, one that is far more detailed and more grounded than any version of British prehistoric history that could have been told 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. And that story, for all its incompleteness, is the most extraordinary story this island has to tell. Now let us talk about something that is easy to overlook in the emphasis on genetic replacement, the things that persisted. Because for all the drama of the Bell-Beaker replacement and the Anglo-Saxon settlement, there were things that each incoming population inherited from its predecessors. Things that were too deeply embedded in the landscape or in social practice to be simply erased. The most obvious of these is the landscape itself. Britain is a small island with a varied and beautiful topography, and it has been modified by human activity for so long that it is impossible to separate the natural landscape from the human landscape at any point in the post-Mesolithic period. The Neolithic farmers cleared forest and created fields and dug earthworks. The Bronze Age people modified those fields and created their own earthworks and built their round barrows on the highest points of the landscape. The Iron Age people created their massive hill forts and their complex field systems. The Romans built their roads and their towns and their villas. By the time the Anglo-Saxons arrived, the British landscape was already thousands of years deep in human modification. The fields that had been cleared in the Neolithic were still fields, maintained through all the subsequent genetic and cultural transitions by the simple fact that the land had been cleared and was better for farming and was used accordingly. The rivers had their Brittonic Celtic names, and the Romano-British population had added Latin names to some of the major features. And the Anglo-Saxons would add their own layer of naming to the villages and the farmsteads they created. But the underlying landscape, shaped by millennia of human activity, was inherited by each successive population. This inheritance of the modified landscape is one of the continuities that runs through the genetic discontinuities. The Bell-Beaker people did not have to start from scratch when they arrived in Britain. They inherited a landscape that the Neolithic population had already modified for agriculture. The Anglo-Saxon settlers did not encounter a virgin wilderness. They arrived in a landscape that had been farmed and modified for over 3,000 years. And the monuments themselves, the great earthworks and stone structures of the prehistoric period, persisted through the genetic transitions, not necessarily maintained actively, but also not entirely forgotten. The hill forts of the Iron Age were sometimes built in locations that had been significant in the Bronze Age. The medieval English, building their churches, sometimes chose locations that had been sacred in pre-Christian times, locations that retained a sense of significance through multiple religious and cultural transitions. The landscape carries memory, not genetic memory, but cultural and physical memory, encoded in the shapes of earthworks and the locations of significant features and the names of places. And the people who inhabit the landscape absorb that memory in ways that are not entirely conscious, through the experience of living in a place that has been shaped by thousands of years of human intention. That accumulated memory is part of what makes English landscape feel the way it does, to the people who know it well. The sense that the landscape has depth, that the hills and the valleys and the rivers have been looked at and used and named by so many people over so long a time that they carry a weight of meaning beyond their immediate physical properties. That is not imagination. That is an accurate perception of a real thing. The landscape has depth because it has been inhabited for so very long, and the people who have inhabited it for the last 1,500 years, the English in the historical sense of the word, are themselves an expression of that depth. They did not create the landscape they live in. They inherited it, along with all its modifications and all its embedded history, and they in turn have modified it and added to it, and will leave their own layer for their successors to inherit. That is the ongoing project of habitation, the accumulation of human intention in a place, layer upon layer, stretching back to the first moment someone stopped moving and decided to stay. In Britain, that moment stretches back 9,000 years to the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who made camps on the banks of rivers that are now under 50 meters of water. Their camps are gone, their language is gone, their culture is gone, but the rivers are still there, with names that may preserve echoes of their speech, and the people who live near those rivers carry, at the faintest possible level, traces of the genes of those people who fished those waters before the sea covered the land. That is the deepest connection, the longest thread, the most ancient inheritance. And it runs through the English, as it runs through all the peoples of these islands, invisible and silent and real. There are things we still do not understand about the genetics of the English that may eventually illuminate the story further. One of the most intriguing is the question of what happened to British genetic diversity in the period between the Bell-Beaker replacement and the Anglo-Saxon settlement, a span of roughly 2,000 years, during which the island was relatively stable genetically. During those 2,000 years, the Bell-Beaker founding population was evolving in isolation on the island, subject to the pressures of island life. Genetic diversity, in the sense of the range of variants present in the population, typically decreases over time in an isolated population, as genetic drift eliminates rarer variants and as selection reinforces certain variants over others. The British Bronze Age and Iron Age populations should show, on this basis, somewhat reduced genetic diversity compared to their continental counterparts of the same period, who were subject to ongoing mixing with neighboring populations. The ancient DNA data is beginning to address this question, though the analysis is complex. There does appear to be a specific pattern of reduced genetic diversity in Iron Age British populations compared to contemporary continental populations, consistent with the island isolation model. And there is evidence that certain gene variants that were at relatively low frequencies in the Bell-Beaker founding population drifted up to higher frequencies during the Bronze Age and Iron Age simply through the operation of genetic drift in a partly isolated population. This drift component is one of the less discussed aspects of the English genetic distinctiveness, but it may be more important than is often acknowledged. The specific combination of gene frequencies that characterizes the modern English population is not simply the sum of the founding events. It is the sum of the founding events, plus 2,000 years of island drift, plus the Anglo-Saxon addition, plus another 500 years of drift in the post-Anglo-Saxon population, plus the minor contributions of the Vikings and the Normans and the various other smaller migration events of the medieval period. At each stage, the drift component is adding its own idiosyncratic contribution to the final profile. Genetic drift is not random in the way that the word random might imply. It has a direction, which is set by the starting point, and it has a pace, which is determined by the population size. A small population drifts faster than a large one. A partly isolated population drifts in a direction that diverges from its source population. Britain's island geography and the relatively small size of its prehistoric and early historic populations made it a particularly productive environment for genetic drift, and the direction of that drift, set by the specific combination of traits present in the Bell-Beaker founding population, was consistently toward the light pigmentation, tall-statured, specific immune profile end of the spectrum of possibilities within the founder's range of variation. Not because any of those traits were necessarily selected for individually, though some of them were, but because they happened to be present at higher frequencies in the founder population, and drift amplified them further. The result is a population that sits at a specific and somewhat extreme position in the European distribution of these traits. Not the most extreme, Scandinavians are lighter pigmented on average. Some Central European populations show even higher step ancestry. But extreme in the specific British combination, the specific balance of ancestral components and drifted trait frequencies that characterizes the English genome. That combination is unique. It is not more valuable than any other combination, but it is unique, and its uniqueness is the product of a genuinely unusual history. A history that involved catastrophic sea level change and repeated population, replacement and island isolation, and all the other events we have been tracing. There is a thought experiment that sometimes helps crystallize what the science is actually saying about all of this. Imagine that you could gather a random sample of 1,000 English people from different regions and different family backgrounds, and a random sample of 1,000 French people, and 1,000 German people, and 1,000 Danish people. And imagine that you could, without looking at any of them, or knowing anything about their culture or their nationality, analyze only their DNA and try to sort them into their groups. The machine learning algorithms that modern population geneticists used for exactly this kind of analysis, would do better than chance at assigning people to their correct population. Not perfectly, because the populations overlap significantly, and there are English people whose DNA looks very similar to German or Danish DNA and vice versa. But on average, the English would cluster together, and the French would cluster together, and the Germans and the Danes would form their own clusters, and there would be meaningful differences between the clusters. The English cluster would sit at a specific point in the genetic space, defined by its particular combination of ancestral components, that differs from where the other clusters sit. It would show the signature of its history, the Bell Beaker steppe ancestry, the Neolithic farmer ancestry, the Anglo-Saxon continental Germanic contribution, the Scandinavian trace, the pre-Anglo-Saxon British residual, all in their specific proportions. That cluster is what the science means when it says the English have a distinct genetic profile. Not that every English person is genetically identical, which they obviously are not. Not that every English person looks the same, which they obviously do not. But that the statistical distribution of their genetic variants sits at a specific point in the European space that reflects their specific history. And that specific history, laid out over 9,000 years of island life in the North Atlantic, is the answer to the question we began with. The English look the way they do because their history made them that way. And their history made them that way because of an extraordinary sequence of contingent events, any one of which could have been different. The accident of island geography, the accident of timing in the Bell Beaker migration, the accident of which Anglo-Saxon communities settled where, the accident of which Viking ships landed on which coasts, all of it contingent, all of it producing, in aggregate, the specific population that emerged from those contingencies, and all of it still present, 9,000 years deep, in the faces and the bodies and the DNA of the people walking the streets of every English city today. That is a remarkable thing to know. That is a remarkable thing to carry with you into sleep. The sky outside is whatever sky it is where you are right now. The light is whatever quality of light falls on your part of the world at this hour. And wherever you are hearing the story of an island that has been shaped by forces stretching back to before it was an island, shaped by catastrophe and contingency, and the slow accumulation of human presence over centuries and millennia. That story is the story of a place. And the place, in turn, is the story of the people who have lived in it and been shaped by it and left their traces in it. From the Mesolithic hunter on the banks of a drowned river to the child sleeping tonight in a house built on land that has been farmed for 3,000 years, all of them connected, all of them part of the same long, strange journey that produced this moment, this night, this quiet. Let the connections settle around you. Let the depth of it rest on you gently, the way old things rest, without weight but with presence. The presence of 9,000 years of continuous human habitation of a rainy island in the North Atlantic. You are not separate from that. You are part of it, in whatever way your own history connects you to these islands, and those islands connect you to everything that came before. The North Sea is where it always was. The rivers have their old names. The land has its long memory. And you have this story now to carry with you. Sleep well. Good night. There is a field in Oxfordshire, unremarkable to anyone passing through it, that sits on top of something remarkable. Beneath the topsoil and the subsoil and the geology of the last 10,000 years, there are traces of a settlement that dates to the early Neolithic period, the first centuries after farming arrived in Britain. Not a grand monument, not a long barrow or a causewayed enclosure. Just a settlement, a place where people lived and kept animals and grew crops and buried their dead in small individual graves in the manner of the incoming farming culture. The settlement was there for perhaps 2 or 3 centuries in the period between 3900 and 3600 BCE. Then it was abandoned, as many early Neolithic settlements were, and the land returned to scrub and eventually to forest, and the settlement was buried under the accumulating soil of the subsequent millennia. When it was excavated, the genetic analysis of the individuals buried there confirmed what has now been found at dozens of similar sites across Britain. These were people of predominantly Anatolian Neolithic ancestry, the descendants of the farming migration that had brought agriculture to Britain a few generations earlier. But one of the individuals buried in that settlement was different. One individual showed a significant proportion of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, perhaps 30%, mixed with the predominant Anatolian Neolithic profile of the rest of the community. This individual was not an outsider. The burial was in the same style as the others. The person was interred in the same manner, with the same kinds of associated materials. This was a member of the community. But this person carried within their genome evidence of a mixing event, somewhere in their recent ancestry, between the Neolithic farming population and the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, who were still present in Britain at this early period. This individual is one of the rare windows into what the actual interface between the two populations looked like. Not a wave of replacement, but a specific moment of encounter and intermixing, preserved in the DNA of a person who was fully part of the farming community, but who carried the genetic legacy of the people the farming community was in the process of displacing. That person had grandparents or great-grandparents from both worlds, from the farming world that was transforming the British landscape, and from the hunting world that had inhabited it for thousands of years before. They lived at the hinge point of a transformation that would eventually eliminate the hunting world entirely, and they did not know it. They were just a member of their community, farming their fields and keeping their animals and burying their dead in the manner of their people. But their DNA remembered, and now, 4,000 years after they were buried in that Oxfordshire field, their genome has been read, and the story it tells is a tiny but vivid fragment of the larger story we have been tracing. Stories like this one are being extracted from the soil of Britain at an increasing rate as ancient DNA analysis improves and becomes cheaper and more widely applied. Each individual genome is a story, compressed and encoded in chemical form, waiting in the darkness of a burial for someone to come along with the tools to read it. The reading is not always possible, the preservation is not always good enough, and the interpretation is not always straightforward. But when it works, it produces exactly this: a glimpse of a specific individual at a specific moment in the long sequence of events that shaped the people of this island. And the accumulation of those individual glimpses is building a picture of British prehistory that is more human, more personal, more specific than any version of the story that could have been told before. The demographic abstractions, the waves of migration, and the replacement percentages are still true and still important, but they are grounded now in individuals, in specific people who lived specific lives and left specific genetic traces that can be read with specific levels of confidence. The Amesbury archer, the Cheddar man, the Oxfordshire Neolithic individual with their mixed ancestry, the Anglo-Saxon individuals whose graves in Cambridgeshire have been sequenced and whose continental Germanic ancestry is clear in their DNA. The Viking Age individuals from York whose Scandinavian ancestry was confirmed by ancient DNA analysis. The medieval individuals from various English sites who show the population that had settled into something close to its modern form. Each of them is a data point, and each of them is a person. And the combination of those two things is what makes ancient DNA research so compelling and so humanizing. The science does not reduce the past to numbers. It does the opposite. It recovers the specificity of individuals who were, until very recently, completely anonymous. This is, in itself, a kind of justice. The Mesolithic hunter in Gough's cave lived approximately 9,000 years ago and left no written record of any kind. We do not know their name. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what they believed or what they loved or what they feared. But we know what color their eyes were. We know what they likely ate from the stable isotope analysis of their bones. We know that they were present in this landscape at a specific point in time, and that their body was deposited in this cave, and that their bones survived long enough for a 21st century laboratory to extract and read their DNA. They are not entirely lost. Some trace of them remains, and that trace, multiplied across hundreds and eventually thousands of individuals from across the breadth of British prehistory, is what the ancient DNA revolution is building into a new kind of history. A history that runs not just through the documents and the monuments and the artifacts, but through the bodies of the people themselves, preserved in the soil and in the cave deposits, and in the sediment of river valleys, and in the DNA of their descendants, walking through the streets of British cities today. That history is deeper than any version of history that can be written with words alone. It goes down through the layers that words cannot reach, down to the level of the body itself, the most fundamental archive there is. And the story it tells about the English, about why this population looks the way it looks and carries the genetic profile it carries, is a story that does justice to the complexity of what actually happened on this island over the last 9,000 years. A complexity that none of the participants knew they were creating. A complexity that is only becoming visible now, when the tools exist to read what the bodies have been keeping in silence. The English did not choose their genetic history. No one chooses the history that made them. But the history is real, and it is specific, and it is more interesting than any myth that has been substituted for it. And that specificity, that particular combination of geological accident and demographic contingency and island isolation and multiple waves of migration from specific directions at specific times, is why the English look the way they do, different from the French and the Germans and the Danes and all their other European neighbours. Not better, not worse, not more European or less European, simply different in the specific way that 9,000 years of this specific history makes different. There is one more thing worth saying about what this story means for how we think about identity and belonging and the relationship between genetics and culture. The modern English are the product of multiple migrations over a very long time. Each wave of migrants who came to this island contributed something, genetically or culturally or both, to what eventually became the English population and the English culture. The Neolithic farmers who built the long barrows, the Bell-Beaker people who erected the great trilithons at Stonehenge, the Iron Age Britons who created the hill forts, the Anglo-Saxon settlers who gave the language its core, the Viking traders who gave it so many of the words for everyday life, the Norman lords who gave it its legal vocabulary and its French overlay. None of these groups were English in the modern sense. None of them thought of themselves as contributing to a national identity that did not yet exist. They were simply doing what people do, moving when conditions required it, settling where land was available, mixing with the people they found there to varying degrees, building lives in a specific place. The English identity that emerged from all of these movements is not reducible to any one of them. It is the product of the accumulation of the specific mixture that resulted from the specific sequence of events in this specific place. And it is still, in the 21st century, absorbing new contributions, still evolving, still adding new layers to the palimpsest. This is not a threat to English identity or to British identity. It is what English identity and British identity have always been, an ongoing project of accumulation and synthesis, happening in a specific place over a very long time, producing something specific to that place and that time that is genuinely unlike anything else. The genetic distinctiveness we have traced in this story is not the product of isolation or purity. It is the product of a very specific sequence of mixing events, each one adding something new to a mixture that was already specific to this island. The English are distinctive not because they kept other genetic influences out, but because the specific combination of influences they received, in the specific order they received them, in the specific context of island geography and climate, produced a distinctive result. That is worth understanding. It undercuts both the version of English identity that imagines purity and the version that imagines that distinctiveness is impossible in the modern world. The English are neither a pure population nor an undistinctive one. They are a specifically mixed population, mixed in a way that is historically unique, whose genetic profile reflects that unique history. And they carry that history in their faces, in the specific distribution of pigmentation and feature, and build that makes the English population recognizable as itself, even in the middle of a continent full of related populations. That recognizability is earned by 9,000 years of history. It is the accumulated weight of all those contingent events, each one adding its note to the chord. It is not a small thing. The night is settling now, wherever you are. The day's demands are far away. The world is quiet, or quiet enough. And you have heard, over the course of this long, strange story, some of what lies beneath the ordinary faces of an ordinary island. Below the surface of things, below the skin and the culture and the language and the history that everyone knows, there is this, a genetic archive 9,000 years deep, built from catastrophe and contingency, and the endless movement of people across the surface of the earth. The English face is the face of that archive, and now you know a little of what it contains. Let that knowledge rest lightly on you. Let it settle into the background where it belongs, one piece of context among all the contexts that make up your understanding of the world. The world is very old, and the stories in it are very deep, and even the most ordinary face you pass in the street tomorrow carries within it the silent record of an extraordinary journey. The Dogger Bank is under 50 meters of cold water tonight, as it has been for 6,000 years. Somewhere in the sediment above it are the traces of camps that were occupied before this story had a British chapter at all. Somewhere in the soil of the English countryside are the bones of the bell-beaker, archer, who travelled from the Alps, and the Neolithic farmer, who built a community on ground that is now beneath a motorway, and the Anglo-Saxon settler, who broke new land for the village that became the English town. All of them there, all of them part of what the island is now, all of them part of what the people who live on it are. The long story does not end tonight. It is still being written. In the DNA of children being born right now on this rainy island in the North Atlantic, in the new layers being added to the old palimpsest, in the ongoing accumulation of everything that this place and its history make possible. But tonight you can rest from it. Tonight you have travelled far enough through deep time, and the present moment is enough. The dark and the quiet and the knowledge settled gently around you that you are a small part of something very old. Let us consider for a moment the particular texture of Anglo-Saxon England, because it has often been described in ways that flatten its complexity, and the flattening does a disservice to what was actually a fascinating and varied cultural landscape. When the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms consolidated across what would become England from the 5th century onward, they were not replacing an empty landscape with a new civilization. They were inserting a new dominant culture into a landscape already thick with Roman roads and Roman towns and the ghost of a Romano-British society that had collapsed economically but had not entirely dissolved culturally. The Anglo-Saxon settlers who moved into the Midlands and East Anglia and the southeast did not build on bare ground. They built around and sometimes on top of structures that were still physically present, even if they were no longer functioning as they had under Roman rule. The Roman roads, which have been justly celebrated as engineering achievements, were also a fundamental organizing structure for the landscape of the early medieval period. The Anglo-Saxons used them, settled near them, named places after them. The Roman towns were, by the 5th century, often partially abandoned and in various states of decay. But they were not invisible. Their walls still stood in many cases. Their street patterns remained. And some of them, Canterbury and York and London most famously, survived the transition from Roman provincial centres to Anglo-Saxon political centres with enough continuity that there is a reasonable case for describing them as continuously inhabited. The people who lived through the transition, the population that experienced the shift from sub-Roman Britain to early Anglo-Saxon England, were living in a period of profound instability and also of cultural mixing that the genetics is beginning to document and that the textual record barely preserves. The sparse and tendentious texts we have from this period, the writings of Gilders and later of Bede, describe the transition in terms that served their author's purposes. Gilders bewailing the sins that had brought ruin on the Britons, Bede celebrating the arrival of the English and the conversion of their kingdoms to Christianity. Neither author was interested in the complicated demographic reality on the ground. That reality was probably far messier than either account suggests. In the East, where the ancient DNA evidence shows the highest proportions of continental Germanic ancestry in post-Roman populations, there may indeed have been large-scale migration that rapidly altered the demographic composition of the region. In the Western North, where Anglo-Saxon influence arrived later and more incompletely, there may have been a longer period of cultural mixing in which both Brittonic and Germanic cultural elements were present simultaneously, before the Germanic language and culture eventually dominated. The linguistic evidence for this messy reality is present, even if it is subtle. Old English, the language that the Anglo-Saxon settlers brought with them, borrowed surprisingly few words from the Brittonic Celtic of the existing population, as we noted earlier. But it did adopt place names from the Brittonic, and it did preserve certain grammatical features that some linguists have argued are better explained by contact with Celtic speakers than by purely internal Anglo-Saxon development. The argument that the English language was influenced by contact with Celtic British speakers is controversial among historical linguists, but it has been gathering support in recent decades. The specific cluster of features in English that differs from all other Germanic languages, things like the do support construction in questions and negations, the progressive aspect, certain aspects of word order, are features that also occur in the Celtic languages. The coincidence may be genuine. It may be the trace of a period when a significant proportion of the population of early Anglo-Saxon England was speaking Celtic languages alongside or before Old English, and when the influence of those Celtic speakers left its mark on the language, even as the language replaced them. If this linguistic argument is correct, it adds another layer to the story of what the Anglo-Saxon settlement actually looked like on the ground. The genetic replacement was substantial, but not complete. The linguistic replacement was eventually complete, with Old English displacing Brittonic across lowland England over a period of a few centuries. But during the transition period, there was contact between speakers of the two languages, and some of that contact left its trace in the grammar and structure of Old English and ultimately of modern English. This is the kind of fine-grained detail that the ancient DNA revolution is beginning to make possible to compare with. If the linguistic argument about Celtic influence on English is correct, we would expect to find in the ancient DNA of early Anglo-Saxon England a proportion of individuals with indigenous British ancestry who were living within Anglo-Saxon communities and presumably speaking, or at least hearing Old English. And indeed, the ancient DNA data does show exactly this. Not a complete replacement of the indigenous British population, but a significant mixing event in which people of both continental Germanic and indigenous British ancestry were living in the same communities. The genetics and the linguistics are converging on the same picture, a transformation that was real and large-scale, but that was not a simple replacement of one population by another, with no interaction. The actual transition was messier, more human, more complicated than any neat narrative can capture, and that messiness is itself part of the story of why the English are the way they are. The English language carries the traces of Celtic contact in its grammar. The English genetic profile carries the traces of indigenous British ancestry in the substrate beneath the dominant Anglo-Saxon signal. The English culture carries the traces of Romano-British practice in its legal traditions and its urban geography and its Christian institutions, which were in place before the Anglo-Saxon settlers arrived and which the settlers eventually adopted. The English are the product not only of what was brought to the island, but of what was already there and what happened when the two met. The meeting was not always peaceful, and it was not always equal, and the power in those meetings usually belonged to the incoming culture. But the meeting left its mark on both parties, and the result is a population and a culture that is neither purely Anglo-Saxon nor purely British, but something that emerged from the encounter between them. That emergence is the foundational event of English history, in the same way that the bell beaker replacement is the foundational event of British prehistory. Something genuinely new came into existence that had not existed before, and it carried within it the traces of everything that had contributed to its making. Now let us sit for a moment with the geography of it, because the geography is inseparable from the history. Britain is a small island, as we have noted, but it is a varied one. The differences between the chalk downlands of southern England and the granite uplands of the far north of Scotland are not just scenery. They are the physical expression of entirely different geological histories, different soils, different climates, different resources, and those differences have shaped the human experience of living in different parts of the island in ways that run very deep. The chalk downlands of Wessex and the southern Midlands, the landscape of Stonehenge and Avebury, and the long barrows and the hill forts were the core of English prehistory. This is the landscape that was most thoroughly transformed by the Neolithic farming revolution, and that has been most intensively studied by archaeologists. It is a landscape of thin soils over chalk bedrock, productive for ancient agriculture, with the right technology, and its visibility in the archaeological record is partly a function of the preservative qualities of chalk for bone and organic material. The heavy clay lands of the Midlands and the North were less easy to farm with early agricultural technology and were later to be settled densely. The limestone hills of the Peak District and the Yorkshire Dales have their own character, shaped by different geology and a different farming history. The granite of the far southwest and of Scotland is different again, resistant to the kind of intensive agriculture that transformed the southern chalklands. All of these different geological zones have their own specific histories of human settlement, their own specific patterns of migration and transformation, their own specific genetic profiles in the modern population, and the variation within the English population, which is significant even though the population is broadly coherent, reflects in part this underlying geological and geographical variation. People who have lived in upland Yorkshire for generations tend to look somewhat different from people who have lived in Norfolk for generations, and that difference is partly cultural and partly environmental and partly genetic. The genetic component reflects the different histories of settlement and gene flow in the two regions. Norfolk being heavily influenced by the Anglo-Saxon settlement and receiving significant Viking period gene flow from across the North Sea, Yorkshire receiving Viking influence from the north and from the Danelaw period, but also preserving more of the pre-Anglo-Saxon British substrate in its upland communities. These are subtle differences, the kind that are not obvious to casual observation, but that are measurable with the tools of modern population genetics. They are the fingerprints of history, legible to those who know how to look. And they add yet another layer of complexity to the already complicated story of why the English look the way they do. Not only is the English population different from other European populations, it is also internally varied in ways that reflect the different histories of its different regions. The English are not one thing. They are many things, bound together by a shared language and a shared political history and a broadly shared genetic heritage, but differentiated internally by the specific histories of the places they come from. That internal variation is part of what makes Britain interesting, part of what makes the story rich, part of what ensures that there will always be more to discover, more layers to examine, more complexity to unpack. The story never ends. It only gets more specific. And specificity is the thing that separates history from myth. Myths are general. They tell stories about types and archetypes and symbols. History is specific. It tells stories about particular people in particular places at particular times, and the specificity is what makes it true. The story of why the English look different from every other European is, at its heart, a specific story. Specific migrations, specific replacements, specific island geography, specific climate pressures, specific founder effects in specific founding populations, all of it leading to a specific population at a specific point in the European genetic landscape. That specificity is the truth of it, and the truth is more interesting than any myth would be. You have been listening for a long time now, longer than most people sit still for anything in the modern world, and the fact that you are still here, still following this long, strange story through the deep time of British prehistory, says something about the kind of curiosity that draws people to these questions. The questions of where we come from and what we carry within us, and what the faces we see every day are actually made of. Those questions do not have simple answers. They do not have answers that fit on a bumper sticker or in a political slogan. They have answers that require patience and depth and the willingness to sit with complexity without demanding that it resolve into something simpler than it actually is. The English are not simple. No people are simple. But the English have a particular complexity that is visible in the genetics and the archaeology and the linguistics and the landscape, a complexity that runs 9,000 years deep and that is still in the process of being understood. That understanding is a gift, available to anyone curious enough to go looking for it. And it changes something, even if that something is hard to name precisely. It changes the way you look at an ordinary face on an ordinary street, knowing that it carries within it the record of 9,000 years of extraordinary history. It changes the way you hear the names of rivers and the shapes of hills and the particular quality of light on a grey afternoon. It makes the world a little deeper, a little more resonant, a little more connected to the long, strange story that made it. The question of where a people comes from is one of the oldest questions humans ask, and it is one that has been answered badly so many times, by myth and by ideology and by the politics of identity, that the genuine scientific answer comes almost as a relief. Not because the science is simple, it is not simple at all, but because it is honest. It acknowledges uncertainty. It revises its conclusions when new evidence arrives. It is interested in complexity rather than threatened by it. And it produces, in the end, a picture that is more interesting, more human, and more true than any of the myths that preceded it. That is what this kind of history offers. Not answers in the simple sense, but depth. The sense that the world you inhabit is older and stranger and more layered than it appears, and that knowing something about those layers enriches the experience of being in it. The faces in the street are archives. The rivers have old names. The land remembers. And now, a little more. So do you. Sleep well. The story will still be there in the morning. Good night.